In the glittering halls of royalty, blood was power, and the family tree was more like a noose. For centuries, Britain's kings and queens kept their crowns close, and their marriages closer. Sometimes too close. Behind every golden scepter lurked a cousin, a niece, or a dangerously familiar spouse. This isn't just royal history, it's a dynastic echo chamber echoing across generations. Forget fairy tales. These are the 25 most inbred monarchs of Britain, and their tangled bloodlines shaped empires, shattered kingdoms, and left behind a legacy as twisted as their family trees. Before we dive deeper into this royal labyrinth of shared surnames and questionable wedding vows, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because these stories only get darker, weirder, and more uncomfortably familiar from here. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now as you listen? Let's see just how far this royal bloodline reaches. Queen Victoria, 1819, 1901. It is fitting that the grandmother of Europe should also be the matriarch of modern inbreeding. Queen Victoria didn't just marry her first cousin, she genetically gift-wrapped a problem and mailed it to every royal house in Europe. Victoria, born in 1819, was a product of the tightly wound coils of royal bloodlines. Her parents, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, were themselves members of the increasingly claustrophobic genetic echo chamber that was European royalty. But Victoria didn't just inherit the crown, she inherited the mission to keep the bloodline pure, a noble euphemism for limited to a pool of about 200 eligible relatives. Enter Prince Albert, her first cousin. Same grandmother, same suspicious jawlines. Victoria was enamored, obsessed even. She proposed to him something rare for a queen, and they married in 1840, creating a genetically perilous feedback loop so potent it practically hummed in the portraits. They were, by all accounts, genuinely in love. But royal love is rarely just personal. Victoria and Albert were ideological partners in a grand mission: to spread their children like pollen across Europe, marrying them into other royal houses to stabilize monarchies and reinforce dynastic power. She had 9 children. Of those, at least 6 married into their own extended family trees. The result? A sprawling, interconnected web of monarchs across Germany, Russia, Spain, Romania, and, of course, Britain, all tethered to one extremely small genetic sample size. But what made Victoria's genetic legacy especially morbid was the shadow of a single mutation, hemophilia B, a blood clotting disorder, deadly at worst, miserable at best. Victoria was a carrier, likely due to a spontaneous mutation since her immediate ancestors didn't show symptoms. But she didn't just carry it, she spread it with royal efficiency. Her son Leopold had the disease and died young from a hemorrhage. 2 of her daughters were carriers, passing the condition to the royal houses of Russia and Spain. One of the most famous victims? Alexei Romanov, the heir to the Russian throne, whose illness became a state secret and directly led to the Romanovs' catastrophic entanglement with Rasputin. All of that because Victoria married her cousin and played genetic matchmaker with a streak of imperial absolutism. The irony is almost poetic. A woman who wielded such political and symbolic power brought entire empires to their knees through a single bloodline decision. Victoria believed in family. Not in the warm, found family sense we romanticize today, but in the deeply political, deeply problematic tradition of dynastic purity. Her personal choices weren't personal, they were strategy. And that strategy was incest-adjacent, at scale. To make matters worse, or better, depending on your appetite for dark comedy, Victoria had a famously severe personality. She abhorred indecency, hated childbirth, but did it 9 times, and reportedly loathed her children as individuals. She ruled an empire built on moral rigidity and colonial might, while overseeing a family tree more twisted than a Victorian staircase. And yet, to her contemporaries, this was all normal. encouraged even. Royal blood wasn't just symbolic, it was believed to be qualitatively better, cleaner, stronger. The irony, of course, is that the more they tried to keep it in, the more it failed to work. One could argue Victoria's hemophilic legacy was a metaphor for monarchy itself, an institution bleeding out in private while pretending to stand tall in public. Her descendants ruled countries that would eventually collapse under their own contradictions, Russia to revolution, Germany to war, Spain to instability. The cost of cousinly affection? Just the slow, ironic death of empires. And yet, she remains iconic, draped in black after Albert's death, glaring from portraits, ruling with clenched jaw and even more clenched jeans. The woman who gave us the Victorian era also gave us bleeding heirs, political marriages with medical side effects, and enough shared DNA across the continent to make a genealogist weep. But the bloodline didn't stop there. Her son, King Edward VII, would take the throne next, bearing the same inherited entanglements. His reign would mark the twilight of Victorian control, but also the continuation of that cozy cousin-to-cousin tradition. Because when it comes to royal inbreeding, the sins of the mother are never truly buried, they're crowned. King Edward VII, 1841–1910. By the time Edward VII took the throne, the royal family wasn't so much a dynasty as it was a genetic maze. He was the second child and first son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, meaning, of course, he was also a grandchild of their shared grandparents. If that sentence made your head tilt slightly sideways, you're starting to understand the hereditary headache that was Edward's family tree. Born Albert Edward, the future king was a living monument to generations of closed-loop breeding. He had the chin of the Saxe-Coburgs, the eyes of the Hanoverians, and a temperament that often felt like a rebellion against the claustrophobic discipline of his parents. Victoria once called him unpromising, which was Victorian for huge disappointment. She and Albert believed in high morals, hard work, and marrying your cousin. Edward preferred parties, mistresses, and not being emotionally strangled by his mother. But let's not get distracted. This is a story about inbreeding, and in that department, Edward VII delivered. His genetic inheritance was the definition of compressed. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were first cousins. Their mutual grandfather, Francis, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, contributed a generous double dose of DNA to the royal petri dish. And it didn't stop there. On his father's side, Edward traced his ancestry back to the increasingly interconnected minor German principalities, where it was once said that any two aristocrats meeting at a dinner party were at least second cousins. His maternal and paternal lines were practically mirror images of each other, like a family photo reflected through a funhouse lens. Add in the fact that his siblings also married within the same royal circuit, and you have a man whose entire genome could be diagrammed in a circle. Edward eventually married Princess Alexandra of Denmark, a woman who was, mercifully, not his first cousin. That was considered a scandalous break from tradition. But don't get too hopeful. They were still related. Alexandra was his second cousin through both Queen Victoria and King Christian IX of Denmark. So while they may have technically branched the family tree, it was more of a polite sidestep than a genuine escape. Like moving one seat over on the same collapsing lifeboat. Their union produced 6 children, 3 of whom would marry back into the usual suspects of European royalty. One of their daughters, Maud, became Queen of Norway, because of course she did. There were only so many eligible royals to marry, and they were all related. Despite the decorative titles and ornate uniforms, Edward VII's role in this story is both comic and tragic. Comic, because he was known as Edward the Caresser, a nickname earned from his enthusiastic social life and confirmed by a succession of scandalized courtiers. Tragic, because beneath the silk sheets and coronation robes lay a body that bore the weight of inherited complications, mental and physical, that no one in the royal family seemed willing to acknowledge. Edward suffered from several chronic conditions, including respiratory issues and a tendency toward obesity. By the time he became king at the ripe old age of 59, he was already battling health problems exacerbated by a life of indulgence, but also likely influenced by his genetic background. While he didn't inherit the hemophilia that haunted his brother Leopold, or the carrier's curse that would haunt the Romanovs, his family's tightly knit genome had other consequences: low fertility among his relatives, an array of developmental quirks, and a general atmosphere of hereditary fragility. But what made Edward especially unique in this genealogy of dysfunction was his public persona. He was perhaps the first monarch to realize that being a king in the modern age wasn't about power, it was about performance. He was charismatic, charming, and able to host a state dinner with the same ease as he hosted a discreet weekend in Paris. In this way, Edward represented the new royal strategy. If you can't outrun your DNA, at least learn how to wear it well. His reign, though short, was marked by diplomacy and theatricality. He tried to smooth tensions with France, made friendly overtures to Russia, and presented Britain as a stable empire, despite the increasingly unstable bloodline at its heart. He was, in essence, a professional distraction from the slow unraveling of royal legitimacy. But perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is the reminder that inbreeding isn't just a medical issue, it's a philosophical one. What happens when power is kept too close for too long? When purity is mistaken for superiority? When tradition starts to eat itself? Edward's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would carry on the family line, but not without cost. The cracks in the royal gene pool would continue to widen, especially in his grandson, George V, the next monarch in line, and yet another royal who married dangerously close to home. Because the one thing the House of Windsor, née Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, couldn't resist, no matter how many scandals or war declarations, was the gravitational pull of its own DNA. And just like that, one crown passes to the next, same bloodline, slightly different jawline. If you're still with us on this winding royal descent into genetic déjà vu, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button. These tangled tales only get deeper from here. And while you're listening, tell us in the comments where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end. Royal drama never sleeps, and apparently, neither do you. King George V, 1865, 1936. By the time George V took the throne, the royal family had officially rebranded. The names Saxe-Coburg and Gotha had become a bit awkward during the First World War, on account of it sounding like the enemy. So George V did what any image-conscious monarch would do. He slapped a fresh label on the centuries-old bottle of gene pool soup and called it Windsor. It was brilliant PR, not quite as effective at erasing the family's Germanic inbreeding history as they might have hoped, but brilliant nonetheless. A name change can only do so much when your face still looks like it was sketched from the same genetic blueprint as half the monarchs in Europe. George V, the grandson of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was a direct product of the now iconic first-cousin match that set Europe's royal bloodlines into a slow, irrevocable spiral. He was also the son of Edward VII and Princess Alexandra of Denmark, who themselves were second cousins. So, from both sides, George's DNA came pre-woven, pre-complicated, and highly refined in that royal way where refined means circling the same gene pool since the Middle Ages. And in true dynastic fashion, George V kept the tradition alive. He married Princess Mary of Teck, a woman whose lineage was not just aristocratic, but geometrically tangled with his own. Mary was technically his second cousin once removed and his fourth cousin through a different line. If that sounds confusing, don't worry. The family tree at this point was less a tree and more a wreath. Just looped and looped and looped. Their marriage, arranged as expected, was more successful than many royal unions, and produced 6 children. But even their children, especially Edward VIII and George VI, showed the cumulative effects of a lineage that had spent far too long refusing to marry out. Fragile health, emotional repression, and recurring hereditary quirks became the quiet inheritance passed from crown to crown. But back to George himself. Unlike his flamboyant father Edward VII, George V was stiff, reserved, and almost aggressively uncharismatic. He was a man of routine and protocol. He dressed like a naval officer long after he stopped serving in the Navy. He ate the same meals, delivered the same small talk, and wrote diary entries that read like grocery lists. He wasn't warm, but he was reliable, like a mahogany table or a tax form. Yet beneath his gray, disciplined exterior was the genetic legacy of centuries of incestuous ambition. His hemophilia risk was real, thankfully. He didn't inherit it, but he had watched its toll on his relatives. His cousin, Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, the doomed heir of the Romanovs, was crippled by the very mutation that had run through Queen Victoria. The family's inner circle often whispered about such things in private, while maintaining an outward image of immaculate nobility. No one dared say it aloud, but by the early 20th century, the royal family's genetic history had become a liability. And George knew it. Quietly, subtly, he began distancing the crown from its foreign entanglements. He refused to offer asylum to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, during the Russian Revolution, a decision that still echoes with moral ambiguity. The two men looked strikingly alike, often mistaken for one another in photos. But when Nicholas and his family were under threat, George chose political stability over blood. One cousin couldn't risk saving another, not when his own throne was already wobbling under the weight of war, debt, and public scrutiny. It was a cold choice, but that's what royal survival had become. It wasn't about loyalty. It was about optics. George V understood that the monarchy had to modernize or perish. And part of that modernization meant pretending, at least externally, that it wasn't built on centuries of first-cousin proposals and quietly accepted deformities. Internally, though, nothing had changed. The royal marriages continued, always within a polite radius of the extended family. The bloodlines remained more knotted than braided. George's children were matched with European nobles of appropriately confusing degrees of relation. And the hidden legacy of inbreeding continued to ripple forward, sometimes in hemophilia, sometimes in personality disorders, sometimes in the quiet, simmering anxiety that seemed to cling to the House of Windsor like old smoke. What makes George V particularly fascinating is the contrast. Here was a man who seemed, on the surface, so ordinary, so measured. But he stood at the apex of something biologically extraordinary, a walking culmination of centuries of choices made not for love, but for lineage. His stoicism wasn't just temperament. It was the only way to cope with the impossible weight of his heritage. The contradictions were everywhere. A British king with a German name, who changed it to sound more local. A descendant of empires who watched them fall like dominoes. A father of heirs who would either abdicate in disgrace or stutter their way through war. The family's genetics, once a point of pride, had become an open secret, an inherited vulnerability that no amount of pomp could disguise. And yet, the Windsor brand survived. For now. But to understand how precarious that survival was, you'd have to look backward again to a time before the name change, before the photo ops and diplomacy, to the Mad King himself. A monarch who talked to trees, ruled an empire, and still couldn't explain his own thoughts. The king, who truly embodied what happens when a royal bloodline turns on itself. George III was waiting. And he brought the madness with him. King George III, 1738, 1820. If George V represented the quietly calcifying decay of royal bloodlines, then George III was the part where the cracks began to show in broad daylight, publicly, loudly, in technicolor wigs and powdered tempers. This was the monarch whose name would become synonymous with madness, a condition that historians and doctors alike have debated for centuries. Was it porphyria, bipolar disorder, lead poisoning, a slow-burning rebellion of the gene pool itself? Regardless of diagnosis, one thing is clear. George III didn't just suffer under the crown. He embodied its inbred contradictions. Born in 1738, George was the grandson of George II and great-grandson of George I, both German-born kings who had been imported like luxury furniture to sit on the increasingly complicated throne of Britain. His lineage had already been shaped by continental cousin marriages that fused German, Danish, and British noble lines into one tight knot. By the time George III was born, he was already the product of multiple consanguineous unions, a man built, quite literally, from the repeated insistence that no one outside a very short mailing list was worthy of royal affection. Yet for all the murmurs about instability that would later cloud his name, George's early reign didn't reflect that. He was intelligent, industrious, and unlike his two Hanoverian predecessors, he spoke English as a first language. He styled himself Farmer George, a down-to-earth monarch concerned with agriculture, reform, and a Britain that was losing its American colonies faster than it could pronounce taxation without representation. But it wasn't his politics that would echo through history, it was his mind. Around middle age, George III began to experience episodes. At first, they were written off as eccentricities, then as stress, then as something more unsettling. His speech would race. His behavior would fluctuate. He would repeat himself, talk incessantly, fixate on things, lose track of time, of reality. He was periodically removed from public life, then reintroduced, then removed again. And always, behind the palace doors, the question no one dared ask too loudly, was this hereditary? The uncomfortable truth was that George had married within his royal neighborhood, continuing the time-honored tradition of keeping it all in the family. His wife, Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was his second cousin. They shared a common ancestor in the House of Mecklenburg, and even further back, in the endlessly tangled vines of the Protestant German aristocracy. Unlike some of his royal peers, George III was at least personally committed to monogamy. He and Charlotte had 15 children, yes, 15, which should have improved the genetic odds, statistically speaking. But statistics start to buckle under the weight of several hundred years of closed-loop marriages. Several of their children were reportedly eccentric, emotionally fragile, or socially difficult. The most famous of these was their eldest son, the future George IV, whose legendary vanity and debauchery made his father's instability look almost quaint by comparison. Another son, Ernest Augustus, would eventually become King of Hanover and was dogged throughout his life by allegations of cruel, erratic behavior. A few daughters never married at all, not due to lack of suitors, but out of what some historians suggest was a deliberate choice to keep the pool of potential husbands too close. But perhaps the most symbolic piece of this genetic puzzle is found in George III's obsession with routine. He lived by it, structured his days around it. When that structure began to collapse, so did he. Madness was not just a personal affliction. It was the unraveling of a carefully constructed royal fiction that these families were special, superior, ordained. Instead, the public saw a king pacing in manic circles, a family struggling to manage the optics, and a nation whispering about what might be flowing quietly beneath all that blue blood. By the end of his life, George III was blind, deaf, and by all accounts utterly detached from reality. He was king in name only. His son ruled as Prince Regent. The monarch who had once been hailed for rejecting corruption and striving for personal virtue had become a cautionary tale, a human casualty of dynastic mathematics. And yet, like all British monarchs, he was never held fully accountable. His madness was romanticized, shrouded in tragic dignity, transformed from a warning into a curiosity. Because if you're royal enough, even your breakdowns are rebranded. But the legacy of George III's mental decline didn't just stain his reign, It stained the fabric of monarchy itself. His condition became a blueprint for what not to admit, what not to acknowledge, what to quietly push under the rug in future generations. Until it leaked out again, in his grandson, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, in his great-granddaughter, Queen Victoria, and in the generations that followed, where the illusion of genetic superiority would become harder and harder to maintain. Especially in one particular branch of the family, a Spanish one, built from the same British roots, only with even less genetic wiggle room. Charles II of Spain was coming, and his bloodline wasn't just close-knit, it was circular. King Charles II of Spain, 1661, 1700. Charles II of Spain was not, strictly speaking, a British king, but his blood? Oh, it was thoroughly marinated in British royalty. Scottish, English, Irish, and whatever else the Habsburgs could coax into their increasingly claustrophobic bedroom diplomacy. And if this list of Britain's most inbred monarchs were a cautionary tapestry, Charles would be the grotesque centerpiece. A walking, wheezing, whispering illustration of what happens when you turn a royal family tree into a circle. Born in 1661, Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. His jaw, famously prominent, tragically dysfunctional, wasn't just a physical feature, it was a monument. The Habsburg jaw, also known as mandibular prognathism, had passed from cousin to cousin like a royal signet ring, and Charles, he inherited all of it, and then some. His ancestry was a genetic Ouroboros. Out of his 32 great-great-great-grandparents, fewer than 20 were unique individuals. Some were repeated multiple times. By the time Charles was born, his parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were not just uncle and niece, but also first cousins. Not second cousins, first. The family gatherings must have been efficient, if nothing else. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with British royalty? Everything. Because the Habsburgs and the Stuarts were deeply interwoven. Charles's grandmother was Anne of Austria, who herself descended from Mary, Queen of Scots. He was the great-grandson of James VI, and I, the very monarch who first united the crowns of England and Scotland. The royal families of Britain and Spain spent generations hopping back and forth across the thin rope bridge of Catholic-Protestant diplomacy, and Charles was one of the more unfortunate byproducts. And his condition? Unfortunate barely covers it. Charles's life was a series of increasingly humiliating contradictions. He was crowned king at the age of 4, too young to rule, too unwell to be properly educated, and far too surrounded by whispering courtiers and desperate nobles. His reign was a 39-year-long funeral march for the Spanish Empire, collapsing under military defeats, economic ruin, and the one thing the Habsburgs feared most, a childless monarch. Because yes, Charles II, product of a royal strategy built entirely on family ties, was infertile. Probably, possibly, no one could say for sure. He married twice, produced no heirs. Royal physicians examined him with the subtlety of a medieval autopsy, and came away with more questions than answers. Some blamed black magic, others blamed God. A few looked nervously at the family tree and tried to say nothing at all. His appearance was often remarked upon his unusually large tongue, his underdeveloped jaw, his slurred speech, his cognitive delays, his recurrent illnesses. But none of this was framed, at the time, as a result of inbreeding. The word didn't exist in the way we understand it now. Instead, the royal courts whispered of curses, divine punishment, poisoned lineage, anything but what was obvious, that keeping power in the family had finally gone too far. What makes Charles such a pivotal figure in the British inbreeding saga is what his reign triggered. His death, without an heir, set off the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that redrew the map of Europe and realigned royal alliances. Britain, under Queen Anne, and later George I, would find itself entangled in wars and treaties that owed much of their urgency to the failure of Charles's bloodline. Even in death, he was a royal burden. When Charles finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, his autopsy reportedly revealed that his body was without a single drop of blood. Hyperbole, surely. But the symbolism was too rich to ignore. The Habsburgs had bled themselves dry by refusing to look outward, and Charles, the last of his line, had become a darkly poetic conclusion to that royal experiment. In retrospect, Charles II is often portrayed as a victim of politics, of religious manipulation, of a family system that mistook proximity for strength. And he was. But he was also a warning, written in flesh and bone and crowned too young to understand what was expected of him. And here's the twist. While Charles ruled Spain, his ancestors ruled England and Scotland. And in the generations before and after him, the same patterns played out in Britain. Cousin married cousin. Uncles married nieces. Dynasties interwove not for love, but for strategy. The difference was that Britain had more fog, better wigs, and marginally less catastrophic facial geometry. Still, the warning signs were all there. Just look at Charles's grandfather, King James II of England, another man with cousine marriage credentials, another monarch with a taste for dynastic unity, another thread in the woven noose of royal genetics. His story wasn't as visibly tragic, but it was just as telling. Because if Charles II of Spain was what royal inbreeding looked like at full volume, then James II was what it sounded like when you still thought it was a good idea. King James II of England, 1633–1701. If Charles II of Spain was the portrait of what inbreeding became, King James II of England was a study in what it justified. Not grotesque or famously misshapen, James wore his inbreeding like a badge of divine favor. The kind of confidence that only comes from being told since birth that your family is chosen by God and your cousins are fair game. Born in 1633, James was the younger son of Charles I and Henrietta Maria of France. His mother, like many royal spouses of the era, brought more than a dowry. She carried Catholic bloodlines from the Bourbon dynasty and a tangled web of cousin connections that made the Stuart family tree more of a decorative hedge maze. His father was a Stuart, his mother was a Bourbon. Both were descendants of the same elite class that had been intermarrying across Europe for generations. And in the middle of this tightly wound political genome was James, military man, Catholic convert, briefly king, and serial cousine marrier. His first wife, Anne Hyde, was technically not royal by birth. Her father was Edward Hyde, an advisor to Charles II, but James marrying her was a scandal not because of her status, but because she wasn't a cousin. Initially, ironically, once their families started comparing ancestral charts, Anne and James were found to be related after all distant cousins via English nobility. So, once again, the gene pool remained thoroughly undisturbed. But James's second marriage was a return to form. In 1673, he married Mary of Modena, an Italian princess, and more to the point, a distant relative through multiple interwoven noble houses. Mary was just 15, James was 40. The match raised eyebrows even in an era where eyebrows were typically concealed by powdered wigs. Politically, it was seen as cementing a Catholic alliance. Genetically, it was just more of the same old story. Marry within the family, preserve the bloodline, and hope the children come out able to sit upright. James and Mary had many children, but most did not survive infancy. This wasn't unusual for the era, but it was especially unsurprising in families where overlapping chromosomes were treated as romantic serendipity. Of their children, only a few lived long enough to make history. Most notably, James Francis Edward Stuart, the so-called Old Pretender, whose birth set off one of the strangest political meltdowns in British royal history. When James II ascended the throne in 1685, it was with all the subtlety of a theological earthquake. he was openly Catholic. Britain was deeply Protestant. And although he promised religious tolerance, his actions said otherwise. He dismissed Parliament, he packed the army with Catholic officers, he held mass at court. In short, he forgot the cardinal rule of ruling a Protestant country. Never remind them you think the Pope is your boss. Then came the baby. In 1688, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a healthy son, James Francis Edward. This was not supposed to happen. The Protestant elite had been counting on the king dying heirless, or quietly producing daughters who would marry Protestants and dilute the Catholic threat. Instead, they got a bouncing baby boy, a future Catholic king, and one enormous panic attack. Rumors spread immediately. The birth was fake. The baby was smuggled in. A warming pan was involved. Was it a hoax? A conspiracy? A miracle? No one could prove anything, but everyone agreed on the next step. James had to go. The Glorious Revolution followed. William of Orange, James's nephew and also his son-in-law, because of course he was invaded England. James fled to France. Parliament invited William and Mary, James's Protestant daughter from his first marriage, to take the throne, bloodlessly, legally, and with a heavy dose of dynastic irony. But beneath the politics was something else, the slow-burning realization that the royal family was devouring itself. James's downfall was not just about religion, it was about perception. The British people were starting to notice that the same families kept marrying each other, that new faces were rare, that genetic diversity was not a feature of royalty, but a threat to it. And James embodied that fear. His insistence on marrying within the same narrow circle, on prioritizing blood over governance, created an atmosphere of suspicion. Not just about babies and succession, but about the whole institution of monarchy. And that suspicion didn't go away with his exile. It festered, especially because the man who replaced him, William of Orange, was no stranger to the cousin game himself. He didn't just overthrow James. He married his daughter, which meant the royal bloodline didn't really change. It just spun itself 1 degree further into the spiral. And at the center of that spiral, a shared grandfather, Charles I. Because in this family, rebellion and romance often shared the same DNA. King James VI of Scotland divided by I of England, 1566, 1625. Before the House of Windsor, before the Hanoverian imports, before the wigs got powdered and the scandals got politely hushed, there was James. King of Scotland as James VI from the age of 13 months, and later King of England and Ireland as James I. He was the monarch who finally united the crowns. Sort of. He also united something else, the tangled bloodlines of Tudor, Stuart, and various continental noble houses, all bound together in one man, who by all genealogical accounts was a royal patchwork quilt of cousin marriages, political unions, and a bit too much Darnley. Let's start with the parents, because if you want to understand the inbreeding, you always start with the parents. James was the only child of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, which sounds straightforward until you realize that Mary and Darnley were not just married, they were first cousins. Both descended from Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. That made James a direct Tudor descendant on both sides, which was great for a claim to the English throne, and less great for his chromosome variety. Their marriage had been a political arrangement disguised as a romantic alliance common in royal circles, where love was optional and lineage was mandatory, and it wasn't exactly a fairy tale. Darnley turned out to be volatile and power-hungry. Mary quickly regretted the whole arrangement. Within a year, their relationship collapsed in a cloud of accusations, conspiracies, and eventually murder. Darnley was found dead under suspiciously explosive circumstances, and Mary's involvement remains one of history's great unsolved royal whodunits. But James was only an infant when it all went down. He never knew his father. He barely knew his mother. She was imprisoned by Elizabeth I and later executed. James, meanwhile, was raised by a revolving cast of Protestant lords, tutors, and guardians, none of whom shared his blood, but all of whom shared a desire to keep him alive, educated, and politically malleable. And James was smart, possibly too smart. He spoke multiple languages, wrote poetry, composed treatises on kingship and demonology, and engaged in philosophical debates with the kind of flair that made his courtiers both nervous and intrigued. He believed passionately in the divine right of kings, that monarchs were appointed by God and answerable to no one else, which, when your entire ancestry is built on a scaffold of intermarried elites, probably feels like the only justification left. But his intellect couldn't entirely outpace his biology. The Stuart line, by James's time, had been marrying cousins for generations. Scottish noble houses weren't exactly known for genetic experimentation. They kept it in the family: titles, lands, alliances, and, unfortunately, traits. James himself had a variety of reported ailments: weak limbs in youth, a chronic stammer, and a speech pattern described by contemporaries as both erratic and eccentric. None of these made him unfit to rule, but they did make him memorable. His gait was awkward, his posture slouched. He chewed tobacco obsessively and had a tendency to ramble, especially in Parliament, where he'd pontificate at great length while MPs quietly despaired. And then there was his personal life. Though married to Anne of Denmark herself, a relative by the loosely woven threads of Protestant nobility, James was famously affectionate with his male courtiers. Whether or not these relationships were romantic is still debated by historians, though the sheer volume of love letters, gifts, titles, and favor heaped upon his favorites suggests more than simple friendship. Some interpreted it as eccentricity, others whispered about deviance. But one thing was clear: his attachments were intense, and always within a narrow, trusted circle. The same could be said of his political alliances. James had little interest in expanding the royal gene pool or inviting new blood into court. Instead, he doubled down on dynasty. His children were betrothed into the usual cuisine-heavy networks of European nobility. His daughter Elizabeth married Frederick V of the Palatinate, linking the Stuarts to German Protestants. His son Charles, later Charles I, would continue the tradition, marrying Henrietta Maria of France, a Bourbon cousin. And so the wheel kept turning. What's remarkable about James isn't just how inbred he was, but how normal that seemed at the time. There was no scandal, no public unease. Marrying within one's bloodline was viewed as an act of dynastic responsibility. You weren't limiting your options, you were securing your legacy. But beneath the theological arguments and philosophical tracts, the truth was simpler. James was a man born of a narrow gene pool, leading a court full of people just as tangled in the same ancestry. He spoke of kingship as divine, but he ruled as a man constantly negotiating between loyalty, legacy, and the unspoken consequences of keeping everything in the family. And as his reign stretched on, those consequences became harder to ignore. His successor, Charles I, would face a civil war. His grandchildren would be deposed, exiled, and in some cases, executed. The Stuart line, once so proud of its blood, would eventually drown in it. But before that collapse came the next chapter. Mary, too, James's own daughter. A Protestant queen, married to her cousin, waging war against her own father's legacy. Because in this family, succession was just another word for betrayal, with a double helix woven tightly through it. Queen Mary II, 1662–1694. If royal history were a tragic play, Queen Mary II would enter somewhere in Act 3, right after the Mad Kings. But just before the empire starts to fray at the edges, she didn't inherit the chaos. She was born into it. The daughter of King James II and Anne Hyde, Mary came into the world, already steeped in the thick soup of dynastic expectations, religious tensions, and, yes, family intermarriage so intricate, it might as well have come with a family tree shaped like a Mobius strip. Her father, James II, had married his first cousin. Her mother was his cousin through another line, which means that Mary didn't just descend from royal blood, she was practically bottled in it. A double shot of Stuart and Hyde ancestry, aged for maximum political tension. And as if that weren't enough of a royal cocktail, Mary's marriage would double down on the family tie. In 1677, at the age of 15, she was married off to William of Orange, her first cousin. He was the son of her aunt, Mary Stuart, and William II of Orange. The couple had the same grandfather, Charles I, which, in the language of royal matchmaking, meant they were practically soulmates. But this wasn't a romantic union. Not really. Mary wept when she found out about the engagement. She was young, devoutly Protestant, and dutiful to a fault. William, by contrast, was older, politically driven, and famously as warm as a Dutch winter. Their marriage was designed to serve two purposes: to unite the English and Dutch Protestant factions against Catholic influence, and to keep the Stuart bloodline safely within Protestant hands. In other words, love was optional. Genetics were inevitable. When Mary sailed to the Netherlands to begin her life as William's wife, she entered not just a marriage, but an alliance built entirely on family politics. The Dutch viewed her as a royal prize, the English viewed her as a Protestant insurance policy, and Mary, she did what she was told. She learned Dutch, she played the part. She even grew to admire her husband, though theirs was a relationship marked more by strategy than passion. But Mary wasn't just a royal figurehead. She had the lineage to make a real claim on the English throne, and that claim became relevant in 1688 when her father, James II, made the fateful mistake of having a male heir. This was not supposed to happen. Mary and her sister Anne were the presumed successors. They were Protestant. They were palatable. Their father's Catholic leanings had long been a sore point, but as long as he had no sons, Parliament could hold its nose and wait for nature to take its course. But when Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward, panic erupted. Whispers of a faked birth and a baby smuggled into the royal bedchamber via warming pan spread like wildfire. Whether true or not, the myth stuck. The idea of a Catholic male heir on the throne was too much for England's Protestant elite. They reached out to William of Orange, who, again, was Mary's cousin and husband, and invited him to invade. This was the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because it was relatively bloodless. Revolutionary because it overthrew a sitting monarch and installed a new regime under the guise of constitutionalism. And here's the twist. William didn't just take the throne. He shared it with Mary. In 1689, the English Parliament declared William and Mary joint sovereigns. Mary, who had technically inherited the crown through blood, agreed to rule beside her husband in a bizarre and unprecedented dual monarchy. It was, in theory, a marriage of equals. In practice, William took the lead. Mary ruled only during his absences, which were frequent due to his military campaigns. And still, the genetic circle continued. William and Mary were first cousins. Their parents were siblings. Their bloodlines overlapped in nearly every direction. And yet, despite or perhaps because of their tight-knit family tree, they had no children. Mary suffered several miscarriages, and the couple died childless, ending their particular branch of the Stuart line. The personal tragedy of their infertility was quietly buried beneath the more public triumph of their reign. The Glorious Revolution gave birth to a new constitutional monarchy, one where the powers of the king or queen were finally restrained by Parliament. It was a turning point in British history, but behind that constitutional gloss was the same genetic framework. Cousin married cousin, heir followed heir. And the monarchy continued, reinforced not by fresh blood, but by political calculation and the illusion of genetic continuity. Mary died in 1694 of smallpox, leaving William to rule alone. Her death was met with genuine mourning, and yet even in death, She remained a symbol, a Protestant queen who had quietly displaced her own father, ruled alongside her cousin, and upheld the institution that had shaped, constrained, and defined every corner of her life. But if Mary too showed how royal inbreeding could lead to infertile unions and divided loyalties, her cousin husband William III would take it one step further. A man who seized power in a foreign land with a name he already shared, ruling an empire built on the premise that keeping it in the family was not just good politics, it was destiny. King William III of England, 1651,702. William III of England was the kind of monarch who proved you didn't need to be born on the island to rule it. You just needed to have the right cousin, the right religion, and the right war. Fortunately for William, he came pre-packaged with all three. Dutch by birth, English by blood, and Protestant by necessity, he was the perfectly inconvenient nephew-in-law to a Catholic king. And the fact that he was also married to that king's daughter, his own first cousin, only made the whole situation more awkward and somehow more royal. Born in The Hague in 1650, William of Orange entered the world already saddled with dynastic expectations and a predictably compact gene pool. His father, William II of Orange, was part of the powerful House of Orange-Nassau. His mother, Mary Stuart, daughter of Charles I of England and sister to James II. That made William not just a descendant of English royalty, but the literal nephew of the man he would later help depose. And Mary II, his cousin and future co-monarch, was both his political partner and genetic mirror. They shared Charles I as a grandfather. They were, in every legal and biological sense, close enough to make modern genealogists wince. But to the royal houses of 17th century Europe, this was perfectly normal, expected even. Cousins made the best spouses, trustworthy, familiar, and unlikely to challenge your claim to the throne. You knew where they came from. You often knew what they looked like. Sometimes, you could even predict their personality based on which side of the family they came from. Efficiency at its most unsettling. William's marriage to Mary in 1677 was a diplomatic arrangement more than a romance. He was 27, she was 15. The age gap raised fewer eyebrows than the religious politics. Mary was the heir to a Protestant throne, but her father James was a recent and zealous convert to Catholicism. By wedding Mary to William, the Protestant faction of the English elite hoped to plant a ticking time bomb in the Stuart succession, a Protestant alternative, genetically legitimate and politically convenient. William, for his part, had no illusions about his role. He was a soldier first, a politician second, and a husband somewhere further down the list. The marriage was reportedly chilly at first. Mary wept for days after the engagement, but over time they formed a partnership that, while not particularly affectionate, was remarkably functional in terms of shared purpose. They both understood the assignment: preserve Protestant rule, secure the dynasty, and keep the Catholic influences at bay, even if those influences included her own father. This all came to a head in 1688, when King James II's sudden acquisition of a male heir sparked fears of a renewed Catholic monarchy. England's Protestant elite panicked. And William, ever the opportunist, sailed to England with an army not to conquer, officially, but to defend the liberties of the English people. It was a neat bit of legal theater. A foreign prince invited by native nobles to depose his uncle, who also happened to be his father-in-law. The Glorious Revolution was, by the standards of revolutions, relatively polite. James II fled. William and Mary were offered the throne. And in a royal first, they accepted it as co-monarchs, a dual sovereignty born not of mutual love, but mutual lineage and political necessity. What made this moment particularly fascinating, however, wasn't just the politics. It was the genetics. This was cousin rule taken to its logical conclusion. Two first cousins, both descendants of Charles I, ruling together not as a symbol of love, but of continuity. The Stuart bloodline, so carefully preserved through generations of cousin marriages, had reached a moment where it could only sustain itself through more of the same. But the dynasty's reward for all that internal consolidation? No children. William and Mary never produced an heir. Whether due to health, disinterest, or sheer bad luck, their marriage genetically tight as it was resulted in a dynastic dead end. And for all their efforts to secure Protestant succession, they did so by failing to reproduce. It was a cruel irony that seemed almost designed by nature itself. Marry your cousin, depose your uncle, and still leave no one behind to carry your name. After Mary's death in 1694, William ruled alone. His reign was increasingly focused on European diplomacy, particularly his obsession with checking French power. At home, he was never particularly beloved. The English viewed him as cold, foreign, and occasionally tyrannical. But he endured not because of charisma, but because he fit the mold. He was royal. He was Protestant. He was, genetically speaking, familiar. In the end, William III's legacy is one of political victory and personal ambiguity. He held the throne, he reshaped the monarchy, but he also underscored a growing dilemma. The royal gene pool, once seen as sacred, was starting to show its limits. His successor, Queen Anne, would inherit not just the crown, but the consequences of this dynastic loop. Another Stuart, another cuisine-heavy pedigree. Another chapter in a family story that couldn't seem to look outside itself. And as we'll see with George I, even when the blood ran thin in Britain, the answer wasn't to diversify, it was to import another cousin. King George I, 1,661,727. When Queen Anne died in 1714 without a surviving heir after 17 pregnancies and 0 living successors, the British crown found itself dangling over a genealogical cliff. The royal bloodline, tangled and exhausted by centuries of cousin marriages and dynastic reruns, needed a new monarch, preferably Protestant, preferably legitimate, preferably not French. What they got was George I, a stiff German-speaking cousin from the House of Hanover who barely knew England, didn't understand the language, and had a family tree that looked more like a Celtic knot than a lineage chart. George, I wasn't chosen because he was particularly charismatic or capable. He was chosen because he was safe. A Protestant, a relative, a compromise. More specifically, he was the great-grandson of James VI and I through his mother, Sophia of the Palatinate, which made him a second cousin to the late Queen Anne. In normal terms, that's a bit distant. In royal terms, it was practically nuclear family. But the real story, the one that earned George I a place in this inbred parade of monarchs, is who he married before he ever set foot on British soil. Her name was Sophia Dorothea of Celle, and yes, she was his first cousin. The marriage was, of course, arranged. This was the 17th century, after all, and royal matchmaking was less about romance and more about reducing the number of claimants who might challenge your throne. Marrying your cousin was less taboo than strategic. You kept your lands, you kept your titles, and more importantly, you kept your bloodline inside a political echo chamber. George and Sophia Dorothea had 2 children together, a son who would become George II, and a daughter, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. The dynasty was secured, but the marriage itself was a disaster. George reportedly never loved his wife. He carried on with mistresses almost immediately. Sophia Dorothea, feeling emotionally exiled and politically trapped, eventually took a lover of her own, a Swedish count named Königsmark. It didn't end well. Königsmark disappeared under suspicious circumstances, widely believed to have been murdered. George had Sophia Dorothea locked away in a remote castle in Alden, where she would remain for the rest of her life, 30 years of confinement, outliving George himself. So, to recap, George, I married his first cousin, possibly ordered the death of his wife's lover, imprisoned her for decades, and inherited the British throne based entirely on the fact that he was the most genetically acceptable Protestant left. Royal romance, it was not. But what made George's reign particularly bizarre was how utterly un-British he remained. He was the king of Great Britain and Ireland, but his heart and his court stayed in Hanover. He visited England only when required. He never bothered to learn English beyond a few ceremonial phrases. His advisors did most of the talking, and Parliament slowly grew stronger in his absence. This suited the British political elite just fine. A foreign king who didn't meddle was preferable to a native one who did. George's distance gave Parliament the space to grow into real power, and in the process, the British monarchy began its long transformation from ruling institution to symbolic figurehead. Still, George's foreignness was more than just cultural. It was deeply biological. His bloodline, like so many before him, was the product of cousin marriages, dynastic alliances, and generations of noble in-group loyalty. He was descended from both the Stuarts and the Palatinate branch of the Wittelsbach's names that, by the 18th century, had appeared so often in the royal genealogy that they might as well have been menu options. And as with so many monarchs before him, this tight family loop had its side effects. Reports suggest George, I may have suffered from various mild health issues, not as dramatic as some of his inbred cousins in Spain or Austria, but indicative of the wear and tear that comes with limited genetic diversity. His famously stoic demeanor was sometimes read as coldness, other times as a symptom of a mind trapped between languages, nations, and expectations he never fully embraced. Even his appearance was, according to portraits and commentary, unremarkable but stiff, almost mechanical, a man designed by committee, and in a way, he was. George wasn't just king, he was the product of centuries of political crossbreeding, an attempt to balance Protestantism with legitimacy, monarchy with parliament, England with Germany. And despite it all, despite the cousin marriage, the locked-up wife, the language gap, and the absentee governance his dynasty endured, his son, George II, would take the throne next, another product of cousine pairing, another ruler torn between two countries, two languages, and two visions of monarchy. But unlike his father, George II would lean more fully into the role of British king without letting go of the ancestral habit of marrying within a 5-foot radius on the family tree. Because if there's one thing the Hanoverians believed in more than diplomacy or constitutional monarchy, it was tradition. And tradition meant keeping it in the family, always. King George II, 1683–1760. King George II was the kind of monarch who could make a cousin marriage feel like a constitutional obligation. By the time he took the throne in 1727, the practice of intra-family royal matchmaking had gone from an open secret to an expected state function. The British monarchy, now officially under the Hanoverian brand, wasn't just tolerating inbreeding, it was running on it like a well-oiled but genetically unadventurous machine. George II was born in Hanover in 1683, the eldest son of George I and his first cousin, Sophia Dorothea of Celle. That alone would have been enough to land him on this list. First cousin marriages were hardly a novelty by this point in the family line, but they still packed a genealogical punch. He was the product of a union designed to consolidate power and prevent dynastic competition, a familiar move repeated so many times in the House of Hanover that it barely registered as unusual. But if George's parents were cousins, his marriage would ensure that the tradition didn't just continue, where it doubled down. In 1705, George married Caroline of Ansbach, a woman who was, depending on which branch you trace, his third cousin, fourth cousin, or second cousin once removed, possibly all three. The Hanoverians were nothing if not efficient in their ability to overlap bloodlines. Caroline herself descended from the House of Brandenburg and the Palatinate line family so thoroughly intertwined with the Stuart and Hanoverian branches that charting her ancestry requires a dedicated research team and a willingness to forgive circular logic. And yet, Caroline was no passive participant. Intelligent, politically astute, and reportedly more charismatic than George himself, she managed to maneuver her way into significant influence over both court politics and her husband's decision-making. Their marriage, while certainly dynastic, was also surprisingly functional, at least by royal standards. They had 9 children together, which for a cousin marriage in that era was practically a public relations triumph. But here's where it gets murkier. The children they produced didn't exactly burst with vitality. Several died in infancy. Those who survived often led difficult, strained lives, particularly Frederick, Prince of Wales, George II's heir apparent. Frederick had a famously hostile relationship with his father. Their mutual loathing became something of a public joke, though the implications were anything but funny. Some attributed their discord to personal temperament. Others quietly wondered if there was something in the blood. George himself wasn't exactly a revolutionary leader. He was the last British monarch to be born outside of Britain and the last to personally lead troops in battle, most notably at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. For that, he earned a bit of patriotic flair, but otherwise he ruled in a time when kings were slowly losing their grip on direct political power. Parliament was growing stronger. Prime ministers were becoming actual forces of governance. George was more ceremonial than sovereign, and he didn't take kindly to that reality. He clashed repeatedly with his ministers, especially Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister. The king wanted to rule as well as reign. Parliament preferred that he sit quietly and let the adults do the talking. It was a transition period, and George II was its emblem. A monarch with one foot in the old world of divine right and the other reluctantly planted in modern constitutionalism. And like his father before him, George II never fully let go of his roots. His heart and much of his attention remained with Hanover. He spent large swaths of his reign fixated on continental politics, dragging Britain into wars that were more about securing German interests than defending the island nation. His dual identity as King of Great Britain and Elector of Hanover made for a complicated foreign policy, one that blurred the lines between personal interest and national duty. But beneath all of this, beneath the court dramas, the cabinet tensions, and the occasional battlefield heroics, was the genetic issue that wouldn't go away. The Hanoverian bloodline, already running thin on variation, was being pressed through another generation of close proximity pairings. The same names kept appearing on marriage contracts. The same family portraits showed up in different frames. The same genetic markers quietly passed from one cousin to the next. Even George's legacy was something of a hereditary compromise. When his eldest son, Frederick, died unexpectedly in 1751, the line of succession passed to his grandson, who would become George III. Another product of cousin marriage. Another monarch whose reign would be defined not just by politics, but by the invisible, compounding weight of inherited contradictions. So while George II may not have been the most notorious monarch on this list, his reign represents something even more insidious: normalization. The point at which marrying your cousin was no longer controversial or curious, but expected. The institution of monarchy had become a kind of family business, one where the employees were all related and the HR department was a collection of bishops and genealogists. But, as history would soon reveal, the bloodlines couldn't take the pressure forever. Because when the genetic threads are pulled too tight for too long, something always snaps. And when it did, it looked a lot like a man with 6 wives, 2 beheaded queens, and an obsession with male heirs. Enter King Henry VIII, where marriage became spectacle and bloodlines became battlegrounds. King Henry VIII, 1491–1547. By the time King Henry VIII sat down on the English throne in 1509, the idea of marrying for love was not just unadvisable, it was borderline unpatriotic. Monarchs married for diplomacy, for territory, for consolidation, and, most importantly, for the production of heirs, preferably male, preferably healthy, preferably with the correct number of eyes and limbs. Love was a bonus. Genetic compatibility? not even part of the conversation. Which is how we arrive at the story of Henry VIII, whose 6 wives are more famous than most actual monarchs, but lost in the soap opera of his matrimonial mayhem is the deeper, quieter thread: inbreeding. Not in the flamboyant Habsburg jaw way, but in the subtler, Tudor trademark tradition of, we only marry other royals, and all the royals are our cousins. Take, for example, his first wife and arguably his only true marriage in the eyes of the Catholic Church, Catherine of Aragon. She was Spanish royalty, yes, but also his sister-in-law. And more importantly, she was a close relative through multiple shared lines. Catherine and Henry were both descended from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, making them third cousins. That might sound distant by today's standards, but in Tudor court arithmetic, it was practically cozy. But it gets even messier. Catherine was the daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, 2 monarchs who were themselves second cousins. Their marriage had been a dynastic calculation designed to unify Spain, but the genetic consequence was that their children, including Catherine, were born with DNA loops tighter than a medieval drawbridge. And when she married Henry, it wasn't just an alliance, it was the continuation of a genetic tradition so repetitive it could have been plotted with a compass and a family Bible. Catherine and Henry were married for over 20 years. She endured at least 6 pregnancies, most of which ended in stillbirth or infant death. Only one child, Mary, later Queen Mary I, survived. Historians have debated for centuries why the marriage produced so little lasting issue, but many have pointed to the bloodlines themselves compounded over generations of royal cousin marriages as a silent culprit. When everyone's grandparents are the same 2 or 3 people, nature starts taking notes. And then, of course, came Anne Boleyn. Henry's decision to annul his marriage to Catherine and marry Anne was driven by politics, lust, and desperation for a male heir. It also required him to sever ties with the Catholic Church and establish himself as supreme head of the Church of England, all because he couldn't produce a son with a woman whose family tree mirrored his own. His marriage to Anne wasn't any less incestuous in the technical sense. Her lineage traced back to Edward I, just like Henry's. It was a different branch of the same gnarled oak. But Anne didn't give him the son he wanted either. She gave him Elizabeth, who, ironically, would become one of England's most successful monarchs, and then was executed under charges that included adultery and incest. Charges likely fabricated, or at least heavily embellished, but laced with a poetic irony given that Henry's own family history read like a genealogical hall of mirrors. His third wife, Jane Seymour, was considered a breath of fresh air, a safe, noblewoman from a prominent family. Yet Jane was also his 5th cousin, twice removed. They shared descent from Edward III, and she came with the same stock of noble blood that had been passed around the upper tiers of English aristocracy for generations. She gave him his long-awaited male heir, Edward VI, but died shortly after childbirth. The Tudor pattern persisted: narrow marriages, high infant mortality, unstable succession. By the time he reached his 4th, 5th, and 6th wives, Anne of Cleves, whom he divorced, Catherine Howard executed, and Catherine Parr outlived him. Henry was less concerned with genetics and more with appearances, yet even then, the cousin factor remained. Catherine Howard was Anne Boleyn's cousin, which made Henry's 5th wife the cousin of his 2nd wife. His family tree wasn't just compact, it was practically recursive. But perhaps the greatest irony of Henry's reign is that, for all his obsession with legitimate heirs, his bloodline barely survived him. Edward VI died young. Mary reigned briefly and without issue. Only Elizabeth I ruled for any length of time, and she never married or had children. The Tudor dynasty, despite all the arranged marriages, annulments, and selective executions, ended with the very child Henry had tried to disinherit. What he left behind was a country torn between papal allegiance and Protestant sovereignty, and a royal line that had spent generations attempting to balance dynastic purity with biological reality. And in the center of that balancing act stood Henry, bloated with power, obsessed with succession, and genetically entangled with nearly every noble family in Europe. His legacy wouldn't just be religious reform or monarchical absolutism. It would be the continuation of a royal philosophy that saw cousins not as a warning, but as a solution. And the next monarch to carry that torch, quite literally, was a queen born of that very logic. Mary, Queen of Scots, daughter of cousins, wife of a cousin, and mother to a child, who would unite crowns and continue the circle. Mary, Queen of Scots, 1587. There's something almost Shakespearean about Mary, Queen of Scots. Her life unfolded like a tragedy written in advance, complete with betrayal, romance, murder, imprisonment, and a final act ending in execution. But behind the drama, behind the religious tensions and shifting alliances, lay something far more quietly relentless. Blood. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the genetic one. Royal blood. Condensed, concentrated, circulated like a family heirloom, and in Mary's case, almost pathologically looped. Born in 1542, Mary was thrust into queenship at just 6 days old. Her father, James V of Scotland, died shortly after her birth, leaving her as the sole legitimate heir to the Scottish crown. But legitimacy, in royal terms, had less to do with paperwork and everything to do with bloodlines, and Mary's were impeccable, perhaps too impeccable. She was a Tudor on her grandmother's side, thanks to Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. This connection to the English throne would haunt her for the rest of her life. But on her father's side, she was 100% Stuart, a dynasty that, by Mary's time, had already been doubling down on cousin marriages for generations. Scottish nobility had long preferred to keep things close. Marrying outside the family was considered risky, unnecessary, even offensive. And so Mary inherited a royal pedigree that was less like a tree and more like a tightly braided rope. But the true moment where this pattern crystallized was in her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, her first cousin. This was no youthful indiscretion. This was policy. Both Mary and Darnley were great-grandchildren of Margaret Tudor. Their marriage was a strategic consolidation of claims to the English throne, meant to strengthen their mutual claim in the event of Elizabeth I's death. From a political perspective, it was brilliant. From a genetic one, it was a sequel with the same cast playing all the roles. The union of Mary and Darnley created a kind of dynastic feedback loop. Their child, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, would inherit the combined claims of both parents, giving him a blood right to unite the thrones of England and Scotland. But the price of this tight blood strategy was high, and paid in instability, paranoia, and eventually, bloodshed. Because while the marriage looked perfect on a royal family chart, it was a disaster in real life. Darnley was arrogant, immature, and deeply insecure about Mary's authority. He demanded the crown matrimonial, essentially co-rulership, and when Mary refused, the marriage rapidly descended into dysfunction. He joined conspirators in the murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, in her presence while she was pregnant. The episode shocked even hardened nobles, and Mary's public image never fully recovered. But perhaps the most infamous moment came not from the marriage itself, but its end. Darnley died under mysterious circumstances in 1567. His house was blown up, but his body was found outside, strangled, not burned. Suspicion fell immediately on Mary and her close associate, and possible lover, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Whether Mary was involved is still debated, but within weeks of Darnley's death, she married Bothwell, sparking a political firestorm. To many, it looked like not just bad judgment, but premeditated scandal. The fallout was immediate. Scottish nobles revolted. Mary was imprisoned and forced to abdicate. She fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I, another monarch entangled in the same genetic web. But protection was not what she found. Elizabeth, though never married, understood the stakes. Mary's claim to the English throne, strengthened by her Tudor blood and her son's even more potent genetic credentials, made her an existential threat. So she was kept under house arrest for 18 years. And then, after a botched plot to assassinate Elizabeth, a conspiracy that may or may not have involved Mary, she was executed in 1587, a queen born of cousins, married to a cousin, killed by a cousin. But her legacy didn't die with her. It grew. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would become James I of England after Elizabeth's death, uniting the two crowns and starting a new chapter in the same tightly wound story. A story born from Mary's calculated union with Darnley. A story that leaned, once again, on the idea that concentrated royal blood somehow produced stronger claims, stronger monarchs, stronger nations. Only it didn't. It produced kings with whispered instability, queens with no heirs, marriages bound not by love but by blood charts. It produced a monarchy with increasingly narrow escape routes from its own past. And Mary? She remains the most elegant cautionary tale of all, cloaked in silk, surrounded by spies, and undone not by her enemies, but by her family. A woman whose crown and coffin were shaped by the same inescapable force, ancestry. And if Mary's downfall was the cost of one cousin marriage too many, then her predecessors in York had already started paying. Because before the Tudors and the Stuarts, the House of York had been marrying its way into a royal dead end of its own, starting with Edward IV, a king whose bloodline was tangled before he ever set foot on the battlefield. King Edward IV, 1442, 1483. If you were looking for the moment the royal bloodlines started folding in on themselves like origami, Edward IV would be a strong contender. The first Yorkist king of England, Edward came to power in a blaze of battlefield charisma and familial ambition. Tall, handsome, and famously fond of extravagant living, he might not be the first name that comes to mind when we talk about royal inbreeding. But that's only because the House of York was better at swords than subtlety. Behind the armor, behind the velvet and banners, the Yorkist dynasty was already well on its way to becoming a genetic cul-de-sac. Edward IV was born in 1442, the eldest surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, two names that echoed through every major aristocratic branch in England. And like many noble couples of the era, Richard and Cecily were related. Very related. Cecily Neville was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who was also Edward IV's great-great-grandfather through his father's line. That makes Edward IV a double descendant of the same man, from two slightly different angles of the same warped mirror. The Lancaster and York lines, though nominally opposed during the Wars of the Roses, were branches of the same tree, a family fight disguised as a civil war. That meant Edward IV entered the throne room already genetically pre-shrunk. His claim to the crown was based on blood so thoroughly recycled that even Shakespeare had to squint to keep the plot straight. And yet, Edward's rise to power wasn't about lineage on paper, it was about force. He claimed the crown in 1461 after a series of crushing victories against the Lancastrians, including the infamous Battle of Towton, still considered one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. At just 19, he was king, handsome, charismatic, brutally effective. But then came his marriage, and with it, one of the most controversial personal decisions made by a monarch during the medieval period. In 1464, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow and commoner by noble standards. This was scandalous not because of her beauty, which was well documented, but because of her blood. She wasn't a foreign princess. She wasn't a high-born European cousin. She was English-born, lower-ranking, and worst of all, she brought no international alliance with her. In a dynasty obsessed with tightening the gene pool, Edward had opened a window. Or so it seemed. In reality, Elizabeth Woodville was very much part of the same extended noble network that had been quietly marrying and remarrying within itself for centuries. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, descended from French nobility that had already intermarried with the English royal house. Elizabeth and Edward weren't first cousins, but they weren't strangers either. Their union didn't break the inbreeding tradition, it just rerouted it slightly. And they certainly made up for it with their children. Edward IV and Elizabeth had 10 known offspring, several of whom were married or betrothed to close relatives. Most famously, their daughter Elizabeth of York would marry Henry VII, uniting the houses of York and Tudor, and effectively merging two already related families into a single dynasty. That marriage, while politically brilliant, was genetically risky. Elizabeth and Henry were distant cousins through shared descent from Edward III. Their son would be Henry VIII, yes, that Henry whose own tangled family tree would eventually become a national crisis. But back to Edward. Despite his battlefield prowess and magnetic rule, Edward's reign was riddled with the consequences of too much family and too few roles. His younger brother George, Duke of Clarence, was both ally and traitor. George married Isabel Neville, daughter of the kingmaker himself, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and thus aligned himself with his wife's cousin's enemies. That sentence alone should illustrate just how dizzying the family politics had become. And then there was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's younger brother, eventual King Richard III, and perhaps the most infamous figure in the entire Yorkist saga. But more on him later. What Edward IV's reign revealed was that cousine marriage politics didn't just affect bloodlines. They poisoned governance. Trust was impossible. Ambition was inherited. Rebellion was always one royal birth away. Even within his own household, Edward could barely keep his siblings from plotting. The lines between family and faction had been erased by too many overlapping names. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, likely of illness, the kingdom passed into chaos. His son, Edward V, was too young to rule. His brother Richard seized power. The princes in the Tower disappeared, and the stage was set for one final act of Yorkist collapse. Edward IV had spent his life trying to secure his family's grip on the crown, but his genetic gamble marrying within the noble maze, consolidating power through overlapping bloodlines only made the web tighter, more fragile. His legacy would die with his sons. His daughter would marry a Tudor. His line would vanish beneath the polished surface of a new dynasty. And standing in the wings was the man who would both inherit and annihilate that legacy. A king with a twisted spine, an even more twisted family history, and a proposed marriage that would have turned the royal bloodline into a closed loop. Richard III was waiting, and he was looking at his niece, King Richard III, 1452–1485. When historians talk about King Richard III, they often begin with the hunchback, the twisted spine, the withered arm, the body buried under a parking lot in Leicester. But beneath the tabloid-friendly iconography is something far more revealing and far more consistent with the slow genetic self-sabotage of England's royal houses, a bloodline stretched so thin it nearly snapped. Born in 1452, Richard was the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, the same pair who produced Edward IV. That made Richard and Edward full brothers, and thus both products of a marriage between two of the most interrelated noble families in Europe. The Nevilles and the Plantagenets had been shuffling genetic cards at the same dinner tables for generations. By the time Richard arrived, his pedigree was immaculate on paper and increasingly unstable in practice. His parents were second cousins, his maternal and paternal lines both traced directly back to Edward III. In fact, if you were to fold Richard's family tree along its central axis, entire branches would line up in mirrored symmetry. He wasn't just a product of intermarriage, he was a case study in what happens when noble bloodlines stop reaching outward and begin turning inward. And this inward turning didn't stop with his birth. Richard married Anne Neville in 1472. She was the daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, better known as the Kingmaker, and also Richard's first cousin once removed. Anne and Richard shared descent from Ralph Neville and Joan Beaufort, making them part of the same extended super family that had dominated English politics for decades. Their marriage was yet another dynastic consolidation, a merger of Yorkist ambition and Neville influence. In other words, a family reunion with a wedding certificate. Anne had previously been married to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir apparent, which gave the union a splash of political irony. But what mattered more was that it kept power in the network. The Yorkist playbook wasn't about expanding influence, it was about circling the wagons, again and again. Richard and Anne had one child, Edward of Middleham, who was frail from birth and died as a boy. The cause is unknown, but the tragedy fits a now familiar pattern: short-lived royal offspring, chronic illness, no surviving heirs. When bloodlines become too closed, nature often responds with quiet, merciless arithmetic. Yet the most unsettling piece of Richard's genetic legacy isn't his birth or his marriage. It's what almost happened after Anne's death. In 1485, with Anne gone and no legitimate heir remaining, rumors began to circulate that Richard planned to marry his niece Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, his own brother's child. The gossip wasn't entirely baseless. There were political whispers, intercepted letters, even vague suggestions from court observers that Richard had entertained the idea. Whether he genuinely intended to pursue it is still debated, but the fact that it was plausible that it even made strategic sense says everything about the royal blood logic of the time. Elizabeth of York was not just a beautiful noblewoman. She was the last remaining link between the old Yorkist line and any hope of dynastic continuity. Marrying her would have cemented Richard's legitimacy and neutralized Yorkist opposition. It would also have made him uncle and husband to the same person. A union so tight it would have sewn the family tree into a closed loop. Ultimately, the marriage never happened. History intervened in the form of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with a far shakier blood claim, but a far more pragmatic vision. He met Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard died fighting one of the last English kings to die in battle, ending not just his reign, but the entire Plantagenet dynasty. Henry Tudor would go on to marry Elizabeth of York himself, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York in a carefully stage-managed political marriage. A union between distant cousins, of course, because even a fresh dynasty can't resist old habits. As for Richard III, he left behind no surviving children, no legacy, just a contested memory, a few scathing lines from Shakespeare, and a skeleton buried beneath a city car park. But in the context of royal inbreeding, he represents something deeper, the terminal point of a lineage that had been feeding on itself for too long. A monarch born from cousins, married to a cousin, and plausibly prepared to take things one step further. His story is not just the end of the Yorks, it's the warning shot before the storm. Because the next king, Henry VI, had already shown what happens when royal bloodlines tangle themselves into knots, a man who ruled during Richard's youth. A king who heard voices, lost battles, and wandered in silence while others pulled the strings. Henry VI wasn't just fragile. He was the ghost of inbreeding future. King Henry VI, 1421, 1471. If Edward IV was the warlord king, a monarch who ruled with steel and spectacle, and Richard III was the final, tragic echo of a collapsing dynasty, then Henry VI was something else entirely. A void in the middle of a storm, a monarch so emotionally and politically fragile that he often seemed more like a royal placeholder than an actual king. And yet, his reign and his very existence was built on the same precarious scaffolding that had long upheld the English crown. A bloodline so obsessively preserved through intermarriage that it had become increasingly susceptible to everything it tried to avoid: weakness, disorder, decline. Born in 1421, Henry VI was only 9 months old when his father, Henry V, the heroic victor of Agincourt, died suddenly. This left the infant Henry as the King of England and the nominal King of France, thanks to his father's military campaigns and the Treaty of Troyes. It was a triumph on parchment and a disaster in practice. Because while Henry V had been a formidable warrior king, his son was not. He grew up in the care of regents and tutors, surrounded by advisors who quickly learned that the boy's temperament was better suited to monastic life than monarchic rule. He was deeply religious, painfully shy, prone to melancholy, and astonishingly passive. The problem wasn't that he was unintelligent. Contemporary sources noted his piety and occasional insight, but that he seemed fundamentally unsuited to power. The engine of his reign never truly turned over. And, as always, blood was to blame. Henry VI's mother, Catherine of Valois, was the daughter of Charles VI of France, also known, famously, as Charles the Mad. Charles VI's reign had been marked by long, disturbing episodes of mental instability, delusions, paranoia, fugue states. His condition, now believed by many historians to have been a form of hereditary mental illness, was passed along to his descendants like an unwanted crown. And Henry VI, his grandson, inherited more than just a name. On his father's side, Henry was a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, through the House of Lancaster. But even that line wasn't exactly a fresh gene pool. The Plantagenet dynasty had been playing a game of dynastic hopscotch for centuries, marrying into itself, sharing great-grandparents like party favors. The result was a king with the most elite ancestry imaginable, and a nervous system held together with parchment and prayer. Henry's marriage did nothing to dilute the mix. In 1445, he married Margaret of Anjou, a French noblewoman connected to the Valois line, the same family tree that had already gifted him his hereditary vulnerabilities. Margaret was intelligent, ambitious, and politically sharp, but the marriage brought no heirs for nearly 8 years. When a son, Edward of Westminster, finally arrived in 1453, questions immediately swirled. Was he really Henry's child? The king had been in one of his long catatonic states during the time of conception. He didn't speak. He didn't respond. For over a year, he barely seemed to recognize that he had a son at all. That same year marked the start of Henry's most infamous breakdown. He entered a mental fugue that lasted for over 17 months. During this time, he was unresponsive to speech, incapable of governance, and utterly disconnected from the world. The court was forced to appoint a Lord Protector, his cousin, Richard, Duke of York, to rule in his stead. That decision would ignite a decades-long civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. Because here's where the inbreeding and cousine marrying began to cannibalize itself. Richard, Duke of York, had a competing claim to the throne. He was, like Henry, a descendant of Edward III, but through a different son. The difference? Richard was competent, militarily effective, and deeply ambitious. The fact that he and Henry were cousins both through the Plantagenet web only made things worse. The royal family wasn't divided by politics. It was divided by degrees of closeness. Throughout the Wars of the Roses, Henry drifted in and out of lucidity. At times he was wheeled out for ceremonial purposes, crowned, consulted, prayed over, before slipping back into silence. At other times, he was imprisoned by rival factions or gently moved from one castle to another like a high-born ghost. His queen, Margaret, took on the role of political general, rallying armies in his name, defending her son's claim, and trying to hold together a monarchy that had long since started unraveling at the genetic seams. Eventually, Henry was deposed twice, first in 1461 when Edward IV took the throne, then restored briefly in 1470, before Edward returned in force. In 1471, Henry VI was captured and held in the Tower of London. Shortly after the Battle of Tewkesbury, where his son and heir was killed, Henry himself died in custody. Officially, it was said to be of melancholy and grief. Unofficially, everyone knew he had been quietly removed to make way for the Yorkist future. but his legacy lingered an object lesson in the long-term consequences of dynastic insularity. Henry VI was not a bad man. In fact, he might have been a good man, kind, pious, gentle, but he was a catastrophically bad king. And not because he was uneducated or inexperienced, but because he was born from a system that equated royal legitimacy with the relentless recycling of the same few names, the same few faces, the same few ancestral lines. The crown passed from cousin to cousin like a family heirloom, and with each handoff, the weight grew heavier, the outcomes more uncertain, the children more fragile. And speaking of fragile, Edward II was next. A king whose reign unraveled not with madness or bloodshed, but with humiliation, betrayal, and yet another marriage to a cousin. King Edward II, 1284, 1327. If ever there was a monarch who embodied the quietly crumbling illusion of royal supremacy, it was Edward II. His reign was not marked by glorious conquest or constitutional evolution, but by the slow erosion of respect from his barons, his subjects, and eventually, his own wife. But beyond the politics, the betrayals, and the legend of red-hot pokers, which we will mercifully sidestep, Edward's story is fundamentally about something else. A man born into a family so entangled, so relentlessly interconnected, that his downfall felt not like a fall from grace, but the inevitable result of genetic overconfidence. Born in 1284 at Caernarfon Castle, Edward was the fourth son of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. By the time he reached adulthood, he was the only surviving son. His father, Edward I, known as Longshanks, was a towering figure, both literally and politically. He was a warrior king, a legal reformer, and a man who spent most of his life expanding English control into Wales and Scotland with brute force. His wife, Eleanor, was also no minor figure. She and Edward I were deeply connected through European nobility, and while they were not first cousins, they were still related within the tightly woven web of Plantagenet, Castilian, and French royal lines. In fact, both Edward I and Eleanor descended from Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which means their son, Edward II, was already born with a royal family tree that doubled back on itself more times than a medieval tax scroll. And then, of course, came his marriage. In 1308, Edward II married Isabella of France, the 12-year-old daughter of King Philip IV of France. On the surface, this was a strategic masterstroke. A union between England and France during a time of continental uncertainty? Perfect. But scratch the surface and you'll find the usual royal pattern. Isabella and Edward were second cousins, both tracing descent from Henry III of England. Once again, the royal marriage was less of a diplomatic outreach and more of a very expensive family reunion. What made this pairing especially ironic is that, despite the shared blood, it produced the kind of personal and political incompatibility only a cousin marriage could truly perfect. Edward and Isabella were never a romantic success. He had his favorites, most infamously Piers Gaveston, a young nobleman whose close relationship with the king was the source of endless gossip, resentment, and eventual civil strife. Gaveston was elevated to titles far beyond his station, showered with wealth and influence, and openly paraded at court, even during Edward's wedding. It didn't help that Isabella, though barely a teenager, had been raised in the ruthlessly shrewd court of her father, Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, though no one ever accused him of being emotionally generous. She saw Gaveston not as a harmless favorite but as a threat to her position, her influence, and her future children's inheritance. Parliament agreed. The English nobility, long accustomed to kings behaving questionably, found Edward's obsession with Gaveston intolerable. The result? A series of escalating confrontations between the king and his barons that culminated in Gaveston's exile, recall, and eventual execution by a group of noble conspirators. The damage, however, was done. Edward had alienated his nobility, his court, and most dangerously his queen. Still, the dynastic duty had to be fulfilled. Isabella gave Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III, but the marriage never recovered. As Edward's reign wore on, his political decisions became increasingly erratic. He favored new courtiers, the Despensers, another father-son duo whose closeness to the king sparked outrage and continued to rule as if England were his personal chessboard, not a kingdom with restless, armed players. And through it all, the dynasty that propped him up remained frozen in its genetic habits. The Plantagenet tendency to recycle bloodlines, French, Angevin, English, meant that nearly every noble family with influence was also a potential cousin. There were no clean breaks, no new alliances, just the same alliances in increasingly uncomfortable proximity. Eventually, Isabella had enough. In 1326, she invaded England from France, leading an army with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and deposing her husband. Edward was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son. What followed was a political purge of his favorites and, ultimately, Edward's death in captivity under murky circumstances. No trial, no redemption, just quiet removal. But in a sense, Edward II didn't fall because he was incompetent. Many kings have been, and not simply because he alienated the nobility. He fell because the institution that created him had reached a breaking point. The endless cousin marriages, the inter-family rivalries disguised as policy disputes, the refusal to step outside the same narrow genetic circles, all of it had created a monarchy incapable of adapting. Edward wasn't the outlier. He was the symptom. And though his son, Edward III, would eventually restore some measure of royal authority, the deeper problem would persist. Kings continued to marry cousins. Noble houses continued to cross and recross their bloodlines like tangled embroidery. But to really understand the stubborn persistence of this pattern, you have to look back before the fall, before the civil wars, before even Edward I, to the king who began stitching these noble threads together in earnest. Edward I himself, the hammer of the Scots, a conqueror who didn't just forge an empire with war but with a marriage that kept the dynasty squarely and predictably in the family. King Edward I, 1239, 1307. Edward I was not the sort of king who crept around history. He stormed through it. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, he built castles, conquered territories, and issued legal reforms with a kind of iron-willed authority that left barons either trembling in admiration or cursing into their wine. He was long-limbed, battle-hardened, and fiercely pious. A crusader, a warlord, a legislator. But beneath the cold granite exterior of this medieval monarch was the same old royal habit humming quietly in the background, marrying close relatives, consolidating dynasties, and tightening the already suffocating genetic knot of Europe's noble houses. Born in 1239 to King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, Edward came into the world already carrying a triple dose of interconnected ancestry. His father, Henry III, descended from the English Plantagenets and the French Counts of Anjou. His mother, Eleanor, hailed from the House of Savoy and was a direct descendant of the same Capetian bloodline that ran through half of Europe's ruling families. And like nearly every royal couple of their time, Henry and Eleanor were related distant cousins, true, but not distant enough to escape the gravitational pull of the same shared great-grandparents. So Edward, as a child, was already the product of one of Europe's favorite traditions: marry your cousin, secure your lands, and keep your titles under the same family crest. The medieval version of empire building was less about conquest and more about creative genealogy. And Edward, as always, took the tradition seriously. In 1254, at just 15 years old, Edward married Eleanor of Castile, his first cousin once removed. She was the daughter of King Ferdinand III of Castile and Queen Joan of Dammartin, and shared common ancestors with Edward, through the tangled branches of the Plantagenet and Iberian royal lines. The union was arranged, diplomatic, and by the standards of royal genetics, entirely conventional. Yet, for all its strategic utility, Edward and Eleanor's marriage was also unusually affectionate. He seemed genuinely attached to her, even affectionate in private, a rare trait for kings of the period. They traveled together extensively. She accompanied him on the Crusades, a brutal and deadly undertaking, and reportedly saved his life when he was wounded by a poisoned dagger, nursing him back to health in a scene that's been romanticized for centuries. They had at least 16 children together, though only 6 survived to adulthood, a tragically typical ratio in royal families where close genetic pairings often translated to fragile offspring. Among those children was Edward II, future king, future disaster, and future inbred heir to a line that hadn't left the family courtyard in generations. The marriage to Eleanor of Castile, though loving, did nothing to break the royal family's pattern of insularity. In fact, it entrenched it. Their children would continue to marry within the same elite network: Burgundians, Valois, Plantagenets, Capetians, the same names over and over. It wasn't just habit, it was policy. Edward, I believed in empire, and not just the kind you take with armies. He wanted a united Britain. That meant conquering Wales, suppressing rebellions in Ireland, and launching repeated invasions into Scotland. But it also meant marrying into the right families, ensuring that any heir to the throne had a claim not just to England, but to every castle, duchy, and distant cousin that came with the British Isles. So it was no surprise that, after Eleanor of Castile died in 1290, Edward remarried, this time to Margaret of France, his second cousin, and nearly 40 years his junior. Again, the genetics were familiar, and again, the union was more strategic than spontaneous. By marrying a French princess, Edward sought to ease tensions with France and secure future claims to contested lands. The resulting children, Thomas and Edmund, were half-brothers to the already troubled Edward II, and would go on to stir their own share of dynastic turmoil. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Edward's reign wasn't who he married, but who he expected his children to marry. Nearly every proposed match was with a cousin, a niece, or a second cousin once removed. The royal family wasn't branching out, it was folding inward. This strategy worked politically, for a time. Edward's reign was relatively stable, and his military campaigns, though brutal, were effective in creating a vision of a centralized English monarchy. But as ever, the long-term cost of genetic consolidation wasn't visible on the battlefield. It was visible in the nursery. Of his many children, only a few survived to adulthood. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths were a grim part of royal life, and while medieval medicine was certainly to blame, so too was the decision to keep marrying within the same small pool of noble families. The result? A ruling class increasingly defined not just by titles and banners, but by fragile health, erratic personalities, and successions that looked more like family feuds than statecraft. Edward I was in many ways a successful king, but success built on sand has a tendency to sink. And his legacy, the England he built, the royal house he fortified, the line he extended, was always vulnerable to the one enemy no monarch could outflank: hereditary fragility. Because while Edward hammered the Scots, codified English law, and planted royal authority across Britain, he also passed on a bloodline that would crack under its own pressure. A line that led directly to the frailty of Edward II, the infighting of the 14th century, and eventually, the spiraling collapse of the Plantagenet dynasty. But the habit of marrying cousins didn't start with Edward. He was just continuing what his father had already begun. Henry III, pious, erratic, and perpetually in over his head, was the one who truly leaned into the policy of genetic familiarity. His reign didn't just tolerate inbreeding, it institutionalized it. King Henry III, 1207, 1272. If ever there was a monarch whose reign felt like one long attempt to keep the house from collapsing, it was King Henry III. He didn't conquer new lands or lead legendary battles. He didn't redefine the monarchy or forge a golden age. Instead, he spent most of his life caught in a slow-motion tug-of-war between the crown and the barons, trying to hold a kingdom together with the diplomatic equivalent of duct tape and occasionally some actual gold leaf. He ruled for 56 years, longer than any English monarch until George III, but longevity is not always a sign of greatness. In Henry's case, it was more like watching someone carefully balance a house of cards built on a rotting table, and as usual, the rot started in the roots. Because beneath the surface of his religious piety and cathedral-building tendencies was the quiet engine of royal dysfunction, a bloodline obsessed with marrying itself. Henry was the son of King John, yes, that King John and Isabella of Angoulême. His father had lost Normandy, alienated the barons, and signed the Magna Carta under duress before dying in the middle of a civil war. His mother, meanwhile, was a French noblewoman who brought a complicated web of continental alliances into the already cluttered genetic attic of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry was 9 years old when he inherited the throne in 1216, already burdened with his father's failures and his family's genetic predictability. From the start, Henry leaned heavily into the idea of royal legitimacy. He surrounded himself with advisors and relatives who were not only politically aligned with him, but also literally related. He preferred familiarity, especially when it came to marriage. And true to tradition, he didn't look far beyond the family reunion circuit when it came time to choose a wife. In 1236, Henry married Eleanor of Provence. She was the daughter of Raymond Berengar IV, Count of Provence, and Beatrice of Savoy. Though not a first cousin, Eleanor was still a close relative in the medieval royal sense, a distant cousin through multiple lines of descent, including shared ancestry with the houses of Barcelona and Capet. In other words, Henry had once again chosen a bride from the same shrinking circle of European nobility that had been shuffling genes around like a well-worn deck of cards. The marriage, politically, was not unpopular at first. Eleanor was beautiful, cultured, and came with a cosmopolitan court that brought music, poetry, and a continental flair to the English throne. But she also brought a large retinue of Provençal relatives and favorites, many of whom were swiftly granted lands, titles, and influence. English nobles, already wary of Henry's centralizing instincts, now had to stomach a wave of foreign cousins occupying positions of power. It didn't go well. The cultural backlash against Eleanor's extended family became one of the defining tensions of Henry's reign. The English barons, many of whom were also cousins, let's be honest, were outraged not just by their foreignness, but by the perception that Henry was choosing blood ties over merit, loyalty, or basic competence. In reality, he was just continuing a long-standing royal tradition: trust the people who look like you, talk like you, and share a great-grandparent or two. Henry and Eleanor had 5 children, several of whom would carry the same dynastic complications forward. Most famously, their son Edward, later Edward I, would become a successful king and a ruthless military leader. But even he would inherit the same genetic habits, marrying his own cousin and producing heirs who further solidified the Plantagenet family's favorite pastime, marrying itself. But Henry III's real legacy lies not in his children, or his long reign, or even his cathedral-sized ambitions. He spent decades rebuilding Westminster Abbey into a Gothic monument to his own piety. It lies in the ways his reign normalized the intersection of family and governance. His closest advisors were his in-laws. His alliances were built not through new coalitions, but through old names. His solution to political unrest was often to double down on what he already knew: more royal relatives, more cousinly marriages, more familiar blood. Even the baronial revolts he faced, such as those led by Simon de Montfort, were tangled in the same dynastic web. Montfort wasn't just a political rival, he was married to Henry's sister. In Henry's world, everyone was family, which meant that every dispute was also personal, every rebellion a holiday feud, and every succession crisis a family argument that just happened to involve armies. The monarchy was less a national institution and more a sprawling estate locked in a generations-long game of aristocratic musical chairs. By the time Henry died in 1272, the Plantagenet dynasty was fully committed to this model. Royal blood was the most valuable political currency, and the safest way to spend it was within the family. Marry a cousin. Keep the land. Inherit the title. Don't let new blood complicate the paperwork. But if Henry III institutionalized this approach, it was his father, King John, villain of Magna Carta fame and prototype of royal incompetence, who modeled it. John's own cousin-based alliances and familial favoritism set the standard for Plantagenet collapse. His reign was where the pattern began to rot visibly. A king who, even by the low standards of medieval nepotism, took the cousin strategy and pushed it straight into chaos. King John of England 1166, 1216. There's a reason King John is the medieval monarch everyone loves to hate. He's the villain in Robin Hood, the tyrant behind the Magna Carta, the brother who lost the Angevin Empire, and the king whose reign was so mismanaged that England was basically run by barons and lawyers for the next several hundred years just to make sure it never happened again. But what often gets overlooked in the usual litany of complaints, taxation, tyranny, foreign policy disasters, is how thoroughly his reign exemplified one of the crown's most persistent and quietly corrosive habits: consolidating power through family ties, especially cousin marriages, especially when it made everything worse. Born in 1166 as the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John was a royal spare if there ever was one. His older brothers included Richard the Lionheart and Geoffrey of Brittany, both of whom stood higher in the succession queue. John was never supposed to be king. He was, in fact, nicknamed John Lackland because he wasn't expected to inherit any substantial territory. And yet, through a mix of luck, manipulation, and the convenient deaths of more competent relatives, he ended up with the crown in 1199. But before that, he'd already been playing the cousin marriage game like a seasoned royal. In 1189, John married Isabel of Gloucester. The marriage was convenient. She was wealthy, titled, and, most importantly, a distant cousin. The problem was that she was too close. Both John and Isabel were great-grandchildren of King Henry I. That meant they were second cousins well within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity as defined by the Church at the time. Technically, their marriage required a papal dispensation to be legal. Unsurprisingly, John didn't bother getting one. When it later became politically inconvenient to remain married to her, he used the consanguinity issue to have the union annulled. Classic royal move: marry a cousin for advantage, then drop them when the papal math turns awkward. But John wasn't done. In 1200, he married again, this time to Isabella of Angoulême, a French noblewoman who was probably around 12 years old at the time. The marriage caused an immediate diplomatic crisis because Isabella was already betrothed to Hugh de Lusignan, a powerful vassal of the French crown. John didn't care. He wanted Isabella, so he took her, and in doing so, set off a feud with the Lusignan family that escalated into full-blown war with France. This culminated in the loss of Normandy and most of the Angevin territories in France, forever shrinking England's continental holdings. And here's the catch. Even Isabella of Angoulême, for all her foreignness, wasn't exactly new blood. She, too, was related to John through a dense thicket of shared European royal ancestors. The Capetian, Aquitanian, and Plantagenet lines had been intertwining for generations. These weren't marriages of diplomacy, they were mergers, perpetual shareholder meetings of the same 5 families. John and Isabella had 5 children, including the future Henry III, and those children, of course, would go on to perpetuate the same dynastic strategies, marrying within the same noble circles, reinforcing existing claims, and keeping the crown within arm's reach of its own dinner table. In other words, John's legacy was not just legal catastrophe and political rebellion, It was genetic repetition. But cousin marriage wasn't just a private quirk, it was a public policy. John's appointments to high office were famously nepotistic. He handed out lands and titles to relatives like favors at a royal banquet. His half-brother William Longuespay became Earl of Salisbury. His illegitimate children were strategically married off to allies. And his tendency to rely on close kin for loyalty, while ignoring the broader nobility, helped ignite the baronial revolt that led to the Magna Carta in 1215. The Magna Carta, while mostly remembered for its clauses on justice and taxation, was in many ways a backlash against John's obsession with centralized, familial control. The barons weren't just fighting against taxes, they were pushing back against a king who governed like a paranoid patriarch, keeping everything in the family at the expense of the realm. Marrying cousins was one thing. Building an entire political system around that logic was another. John's reign ended ignobly. Fleeing from a French invasion and a domestic rebellion, he reportedly lost the crown jewels in a river, contracted dysentery, and died in 1216. His death marked a low point in the monarchy's popularity and stability, but the systems he relied on, dynastic marriage, centralized power, cuisine-based appointments didn't die with him. They were inherited, intact, by his son. And yet, if John was a king whose cuisine marriage politics helped destroy the Angevin Empire, his own parents had laid the foundation for that tendency. Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous power couples in history, were not just Europe's most formidable rulers, they were also cousins, naturally. Because for the Plantagenets, marrying your cousin wasn't a scandal, it was a blueprint, and it had started at the very top. King Henry II, 1133–1189. King Henry II is often remembered as the iron-willed founder of the Plantagenet dynasty, one of the most formidable kings of medieval Europe, a man of law, intellect, rage, and empire. He was the king who fought Thomas Becket, who modernized England's legal system, and who ruled a territory stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But behind the reforms, rebellions, and royal drama, Henry II's story, like so many monarchs before and after him, is also a story of deliberate, dynastic inbreeding. Not accidental, not incidental, strategic. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine is typically framed as the ultimate medieval power move, and it was. Together, they ruled more territory than any English monarch before them. Their combined holdings created what historians now call the Angevin Empire, encompassing England, large swaths of western France, and several critical vassal territories. But beneath the political arithmetic was a less glamorous, but equally deliberate calculation: bloodline preservation. Henry and Eleanor were third cousins, both direct descendants of William the Conqueror. Their shared ancestor was Robert II of France, which by medieval standards was considered just distant enough to dodge the Church's stricter prohibitions on consanguinity. But it wasn't a stretch by any means. The marriage was arranged not to diversify royal genetics, but to concentrate land, claim, and control. And it worked. Sort of. Eleanor, famously older than Henry by about a decade, had already been married to King Louis VII of France. That union had produced 2 daughters, but no male heirs. Her inability, or perhaps unwillingness to give France a son, led to an annulment, which Henry capitalized on immediately. Within months, he married her himself. If the French king had found her politically inconvenient, Henry saw in her a crown jewel. But while their union reshaped the map of medieval Europe, their family life was less inspiring. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children, 5 sons, and 3 daughters. Of these, 4 sons lived into adulthood: Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, and John. And together, they would wage one of the most infamously dysfunctional family sagas in royal history. The rebellions began early. Henry II's decision to crown his son as young king while retaining real power for himself set off a chain of resentment. Eleanor, feeling sidelined and possibly threatened, began backing her sons against their father. The boys, who had been raised in different courts and surrounded by different advisors, fought each other almost as fiercely as they fought their father. The family dynamic was less ruling dynasty and more traveling civil war. But while the personal drama was operatic, the deeper issue, especially for our purposes, was dynastic. Every child born of Henry and Eleanor carried the same tightly woven ancestry, and their own marriages continued the trend. Henry married off his daughters and sons into the same limited pool of European nobility. His daughter Eleanor married Alfonso VIII of Castile, himself a cousin by descent. His son Geoffrey married Constance, Duchess of Brittany, whose family had already intermarried with the Normans. Even the mighty Richard the Lionheart, that icon of chivalry and crusading zeal, was betrothed for years to a French princess who was both his cousin and his father's mistress, before ultimately marrying Berengaria of Navarre, another distant relative with impeccable noble blood. None of this was considered unusual. In fact, it was expected. These were not marriages for love. They were contracts of blood, designed to reinforce claims, absorb territories, and prevent outside families from challenging the ruling house. And at the center of that strategy stood Henry II, the architect of a dynasty that prized consolidation over diversity. The long-term consequences were predictable. His children, despite their royal lineage and enormous inheritance, were perpetually at war with each other. Trust was rare. Loyalty was negotiable. The family tree may have been impressive, but its branches curled inward, not outward. And as the generations continued, the genetic bottleneck began to show. The descendants of Henry and Eleanor would become kings and queens of not just England, but also of the future lines in France, Castile, and the Holy Roman Empire. They would carry with them the Plantagenet genes and all the rivalries, recessive traits, and inherited ambitions that came with them. Some of their children would be brilliant rulers. Others would be inept, unstable, or unlucky. But none of them would escape the central logic of their creation. Born to rule, born to marry cousins, and born to keep everything, including the blood within reach. Henry II's dynasty would last for centuries, but it would also spend centuries devouring itself from the inside out. Because Henry learned from his own ancestors. Specifically, King Stephen and Empress Matilda, whose bloody succession crisis wasn't just a war of thrones. It was a family feud between first cousins, who both believed the crown was theirs by divine and genetic right, and in a world where royal bloodlines never reached too far from home, they may both have been correct. King Stephen c. 1092–1154. By the time King Stephen seized the English throne in 1135, the realm was already exhausted politically, emotionally, and genetically. The Norman conquest was barely a generation old, and the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy had been decimated, absorbed, or pushed to the margins. The great European houses, Norman, Angevin, Capetian, had begun weaving their way into England's bloodline like ivy through stonework, and while the surface was still intact, the foundations were beginning to crack. Stephen was the nephew of William the Conqueror, born into the new Norman elite that now ruled England. His mother, Adela of Normandy, was William's daughter. His father, Stephen, Count of Blois, was a powerful nobleman in his own right. That made Stephen the product of two deeply intermarried families, the Normans and the Franks, who had spent generations trading cousins like political currency. By the time Stephen reached adulthood, his bloodline was less a tree and more a family bramble, thick, tangled, and predictably repetitive. But it wasn't just his ancestry that made Stephen a case study in dynastic consolidation. It was what came next, a succession crisis so brutal, so personal, and so familial that it would be remembered not for its politics, but for its genealogy. When Henry I died in 1135, his only legitimate son, William Adelin, had already drowned in the White Ship disaster, an event that wiped out nearly the entire male heir pool of Anglo-Norman nobility in a single night. With William gone, Henry I designated his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his heir. She was experienced, capable, and by the standards of 12th century Europe, a formidable political player. There was just one problem. She was a woman. And worse, she was married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a noble house detested by the Norman barons. Stephen saw an opportunity. Despite having previously sworn fealty to Matilda, he raced to London after Henry's death and claimed the throne for himself. His logic? He was male. He was Norman. And most importantly, he was family, Matilda's cousin, descended from the same line, but with the added benefit of a Y chromosome. For the English nobility, it was enough. Barely. The civil war that followed, known as the Anarchy, wasn't just a dynastic struggle. It was a genetic echo chamber made violent. On one side stood Stephen, grandson of William the Conqueror. On the other stood Matilda, also a grandchild of William the Conqueror. The question wasn't who had royal blood. The question was whose version of that blood should count. And when everyone's related, the arguments get personal fast. The war lasted nearly 2 decades. Castles were besieged. Nobles switched sides like chess pieces. England became a patchwork of feudal fiefdoms, each swearing loyalty to a different cousin. Towns were razed, farms destroyed, and lawlessness reigned. Chroniclers of the time wrote that Christ and his saints slept. What they didn't say, though they might have implied, it was that the royal family was busy fighting itself in slow motion, one cousin at a time. Stephen, for all his impulsiveness, wasn't a tyrant. He was brave, often personally kind, but politically inconsistent. His reign was marked by indecision, a soft hand in a hard world, and the near-total breakdown of royal authority. Matilda, for her part, was clever and determined, but widely disliked for being a foreign-born woman who didn't know when to soften her tone. Both were capable. Both had claims. And both were trapped in a royal system that had narrowed its bloodline so severely that succession was essentially a family knife fight. Eventually, exhaustion did what politics could not. In 1153, with both sides weakened and the country on the verge of collapse, Stephen agreed to a compromise. He would remain king for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son but to Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou. That child would become Henry II, founder of the Plantagenet dynasty and future architect of England's greatest territorial empire, another descendant of William the Conqueror, another link in the cousin chain. As for Stephen, he died the following year in 1154. His reign is remembered as one of the most chaotic in English history, but it wasn't chaos born of foreign invasion or popular revolt. It was chaos born of too much family. Too many shared grandfathers, too many cousins raised to believe the throne was a birthright. His marriage, of course, did nothing to disrupt the trend. Stephen had married Matilda of Boulogne, another cousin. She was a descendant of Charlemagne and Alfred the Great, as well as several branches of the Norman line. Their children were double-stitched into the royal bloodline, as both sides of the family tree traced back to the same handful of names. It was, once again, a strategic union meant to consolidate power, secure territories, and keep royal blood from mingling with anything so vulgar as new DNA. And yet, for all the marriages and titles and treaties, the end result was always the same: collapse. Stephen's reign proved that intermarriage could preserve claims, but it couldn't prevent chaos. It could bind the family closer, but not tight enough to stop them from tearing each other apart. And nowhere was that tension more clearly embodied than in the woman who had been his rival, Empress Matilda. A woman, trained to rule, born to rule, and married, of course, to yet another cousin. Because even when you're trying to restore order to a kingdom, the safest place to look for a husband is still across the family dinner table. Empress Matilda, 1102, 1167. History often remembers Empress Matilda as a near miss, a woman who came within inches of becoming England's first reigning queen, only to be pulled down by politics, prejudice, and, most of all, the family that made her. She was fierce, educated, and relentlessly determined, with a bloodline so polished it practically glowed in the dark. But as always, there was a catch. Her story, like so many in the medieval aristocracy, was less about destiny and more about design. Not divine right, but dynastic repetition. Not glory, but genealogy. Because before Matilda ever laid claim to a crown, she had already inherited something else, the results of centuries of cousin marriages. She was born in 1102 to King Henry I of England and Matilda of Scotland. Her father was the son of William the Conqueror himself, a product of Norman French and Viking intermarriage, and her mother was descended from the Anglo-Saxon kings of Wessex. On paper, it looked like a perfect political blend. The conquerors and the conquered united in one child, but in reality, both her parents came from heavily entangled noble lines, and both carried the legacy of dynastic marriages, where the family tree was never allowed to branch out too far. Matilda's paternal and maternal ancestors shared numerous common ancestors, particularly in the tangled web of pre-conquest English and Norman aristocracy. Her bloodline was full of name repetition, regional overlaps, and a well-worn pathway back to the same handful of Frankish and Saxon rulers. And of course, the problem with recycling royal blood is that it makes every succession crisis deeply personal. Matilda's life was defined by 2 marriages. The first was political theater on a continental stage. At the age of 12, she was married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was over 20 years her senior. The union had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with forging a power block between England and the German Empire. Henry V was descended from the Salian dynasty, another noble line with a firm policy of marrying close relatives. And while Matilda was now technically Empress of the Romans, she was also genetically grafted into yet another elite family with its own collection of shared chromosomes. When Henry V died in 1125, Matilda returned to England as a widow but not as a nobody. She was the daughter of a king, the widow of an emperor, and still young enough to produce heirs. Her father, Henry I, had recently lost his only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster and was now desperately trying to secure the line. He named Matilda his heir, forced the English barons to swear loyalty to her, and began arranging a new marriage, one that would, inevitably, keep it in the family. Enter Geoffrey of Anjou. Geoffrey was the teenage son of Fulk V, Count of Anjou. The Angevins were long-standing rivals of the Normans, but as always, politics trumped personal animosity. Matilda was 25. Geoffrey was 13 or 14. The marriage was rocky, hostile, and often distant, but it worked in the one way that mattered most. They had children. And not just children dynastic assets. Their eldest son would become King Henry II of England, founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. But before that could happen, Matilda had to fight. When Henry I died in 1135, Matilda was expected to take the throne, but her cousin, Stephen of Blois, moved faster. He seized power with the backing of the barons, citing her gender and her unpopular Angevin marriage as disqualifying factors. It was a betrayal dressed up as pragmatism. But the real reason it worked was simpler. Everyone was related, and every claim could be made legitimate if you squinted hard enough. What followed was a civil war that would come to be known as the Anarchy, a near 2-decade stalemate between Matilda and Stephen. But calling it a civil war undersells it. It was a family dispute with swords. Both sides were descended from William the Conqueror. Both had married into the same French nobility. Both had supporters who were also cousins, in-laws, or double great-nephews. The war wasn't just dynastic, it was genetically recursive. Matilda did, at one point, gain control of London. She even had coins minted in her name, but she was never officially crowned. Her temper, her foreign marriage, and her gender worked against her. Even among those who agreed she had the right bloodline, there were concerns she might actually use it. Eventually, the war fizzled into a compromise. Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son, Henry, would inherit the throne after him. It was the closest thing to a victory she would get. And through her son, she secured a legacy that would reshape England and continue the Plantagenet tradition of marrying within reach. Matilda died in 1167, never crowned but never forgotten. History would remember her as Lady of the English, a title soaked in irony. She was English by birth, Roman by marriage, and French by strategic necessity, but she was also, like so many before and after her, a queen who never left the family gene pool. And speaking of royal consolidations, the one who arguably started the whole tangled project of combining the Norman and Scottish lines, another marriage within arm's reach of shared ancestry, was King Malcolm III of Scotland. A man whose union would bind Scotland and England tighter than any treaty could, and whose family tree looked less like a symbol of unity and more like an inbred spiral. King Malcolm III of Scotland, H. 1031, H. 1093. When King Malcolm III of Scotland appears in the historical record, he tends to arrive like a man clearing his throat in a room full of louder voices. His story gets eclipsed by the drama of Macbeth, the Norman conquest, and the continental power games of the 11th century. But Malcolm's life and reign mark one of the earliest and eeriest turning points in the long saga of royal inbreeding across the British Isles. Because Malcolm wasn't just a Scottish king. He was a marriage broker for dynastic convergence, a political opportunist, and a man whose matrimonial choices would set the stage for centuries of familial entanglement between Scotland and England. Let's begin with blood. Malcolm was the son of King Duncan I of Scotland and a woman named Sybil, or possibly Suthen, who, depending on which chronicler you believe, had noble ties to the northern Anglo-Saxon elite. Duncan's murder by Macbeth, yes, that Macbeth, turned Malcolm into a young exile, spending his formative years at the court of Edward the Confessor in England. And if you've been keeping track, this is precisely where our familiar themes begin to return: exiled royals, cross-border refuge, and the inevitable exchange of cousins at the highest levels of power. Malcolm regained the Scottish throne in 1058 after killing Macbeth's successor, Lulach. But the political bloodshed was only the first step. What really cemented his influence and stitched his legacy into the ever-tightening royal fabric was his second marriage. A union that looked innocuous on the surface and yet carried the full weight of centuries of dynastic strategy. Malcolm married Margaret of Wessex, an English princess of old royal stock. She was the sister of Edgar Etheling, the last male heir of the House of Wessex. And she, like Malcolm, had grown up in exile, first in Hungary, then in England. Her family had fled after the Danish invasions, and though she had no throne of her own, her lineage was unimpeachable. Through her father, Edward the Exile, she was a direct descendant of King Edmund Ironside, and through her mother, Agatha, she was distantly related to the Holy Roman Emperors. Of course, it should surprise no one that Margaret and Malcolm were cousins, very distant cousins, to be fair, but still swimming in the same shallow end of the royal gene pool. The match, while framed as a romantic union in some later sources, was deeply political. By marrying Margaret, Malcolm gained a connection to the old Anglo-Saxon throne just a decade after the Normans had taken England by force. It was a subtle, calculated move. If William the Conqueror's legitimacy could be questioned, Margaret's bloodline might one day offer a competing claim. And that meant Malcolm's children should be seen as players in the English succession game, which they were, aggressively. Malcolm and Margaret had 8 children, 6 of whom were sons, and as royal sons do, they married well, or, more accurately, they married predictably into English nobility, into continental nobility, into one another's extended families. Their blood, already a mix of Scottish and Anglo-Saxon ancestry, was continuously stirred back into the European dynastic pot. One of their sons, David I, would later become King of Scotland and further deepen the crown's entanglement with Anglo-Norman aristocracy. His policies and appointments were soaked in Southern influence, and his court became a revolving door for Norman knights, clerics, and administrators. The Scottish monarchy was beginning to look less like an independent institution and more like a northern extension of the same cuisine-centric royal culture spreading across the continent. But perhaps the most enduring consequence of Malcolm and Margaret's union wasn't political. It was genealogical. Their descendants would go on to intermarry with nearly every major royal house in Europe. Through their daughter, Matilda, also known as Edith, the bloodline flowed directly into the English crown. Matilda married Henry I of England. Yes, that Henry I, making Malcolm III the grandfather of Empress Matilda and the great-grandfather of Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England. In short, the entire Plantagenet dynasty, the line that ruled England for over 3 centuries, traced its lineage directly through Malcolm and Margaret. And once again, we're looking at a dynasty built not on fresh alliances, but on the careful looping of existing bloodlines. Cousin married to cousin, English blood folded into Scottish, folded into Norman, folded into itself. Malcolm's legacy is often overshadowed by the more dramatic figures of his time. William the Conqueror looms larger. Macbeth, thanks to Shakespeare, glows with theatrical tragedy. But Malcolm, in his quiet, persistent way, reshaped the royal DNA of Britain, not through conquest, but through marriage, not through warfare, but through strategic inbreeding. And if that sounds cynical, consider this. By the time of his death in 1093, Malcolm had done what few kings managed to do. He had placed his children on the fast track to continental influence, ensured a bloodline that would eventually unite England and Scotland, and locked in his descendants as permanent fixtures in Europe's tangled crown game. And yet, for all that careful planning, the one who followed him into history, the king whose English name remains a punchline, would go down in infamy not for marriage or diplomacy, but for doing almost nothing right at all. Ethelred the Unready, the king whose very epithet tells you everything about how well that worked out. Ethelred the Unready, c. 966. 1016. The story of Ethelred the Unready is one of the great cautionary tales in royal history, not because he was uniquely wicked or disastrously dim-witted, but because he was deeply, profoundly average at a time when average was catastrophic. He ruled during an era when the English throne demanded not just a crown, but clarity. And instead, Ethelred offered hesitation, confusion, and fittingly a marriage that tied him even tighter to the very forces undoing him. His epithet, unready, is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean he was unprepared. It comes from the Old English word unrad, meaning poor counsel or bad advice. Ironically, his name, Ethelred, means noble counsel. The result is one of the great ironic nicknames of all time. Noble counsel, no counsel. A man out of sync with himself and, as it turns out, with history. But before we dive into his reign, we need to talk about his roots. Because Ethelred was never going to be a fresh start. He was born into the House of Wessex, a dynasty already showing signs of the genetic feedback loop that plagued medieval royalty. His father, King Edgar the Peaceful, had married Elfrith, Ethelred's mother, who was likely a descendant of the same Anglo-Saxon aristocracy that had been marrying and remarrying within itself since before Alfred the Great. So from birth, Ethelred was a product of dynastic insulation, a prince with a family tree that traced in familiar loops across Mercia, Wessex, and Kent. When his father died in 975, a succession crisis erupted between Ethelred and his older half-brother, Edward. Edward was the elder, but Ethelred had the stronger court faction thanks to his mother. The tension turned bloody fast. Edward was assassinated under mysterious circumstances while visiting Elfrith's household. Whether or not she orchestrated it is still debated. But what mattered politically was this. Ethelred was now king at age 10, crowned in haste, advised by men loyal to his mother, and already surrounded by whispers of murder and betrayal. Family, as always, was both the pathway and the pitfall. As Ethelred came of age, His reign stumbled immediately into a storm of Viking aggression. Raids became invasions. In 991, after a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Malden, he began the policy for which he's most remembered, Danegeld, paying off the Vikings with enormous sums of silver to make them go away. It worked temporarily, but like all forms of protection money, it invited repeat customers. The more he paid, the more they came. England's coffers were drained to feed a policy of delay. Historians later called it cowardice. But maybe it was something worse, indecision disguised as strategy. And then came the marriage. In 1002, Ethelred made a dramatic move. He married Emma of Normandy, a French noblewoman of Viking descent. Emma was the daughter of Richard I, Duke of Normandy. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. Emma's family would soon become the ruling dynasty of England. Her great-nephew was William the Conqueror. At the time, the marriage seemed politically brilliant. Normandy was a growing power, and the Norse settlers there were closely tied to the very Vikings Ethelred had been paying off. By marrying Emma, Ethelred hoped to secure a continental ally who might help shield England from further Scandinavian incursions. But there was, as always, a catch. Emma was Ethelred's cousin, a distant one, but a cousin nonetheless. Both descended from shared Carolingian ancestors, those ubiquitous Frankish royals who populated every noble bloodline from London to Lombardy. So the marriage, like most royal marriages of the time, tightened the bloodline rather than expanding it. They had 2 children together, including Edward the Future, Edward the Confessor, who would eventually inherit the throne. But Ethelred already had sons from his first marriage. This created one of the most persistent patterns in royal succession, a family so tightly knotted that every child was simultaneously heir, rival, and reminder of past alliances. Meanwhile, Ethelred's policies grew more desperate. In 1002, the same year he married Emma, he ordered the Streetbrices Day massacre, an attempted purge of Danish settlers in England. It backfired spectacularly. Among the dead was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. The result? A full-scale invasion. Sweyn took the crown in 1013. Ethelred fled to Normandy seeking protection from his wife's family. And if that sounds awkward, it's because it was. He returned only after Sweyn's death, briefly reclaiming the throne before dying in 1016. His son Edmund Ironside took over, fought valiantly against Sweyn's son Knut, but was ultimately defeated. Within a year, England was under Danish control. And yet, Ethelred's legacy didn't end with conquest. Emma, ever the dynastic pragmatist, married Canute after Ethelred's death, blending the Anglo-Saxon and Danish lines even further. She became queen to 2 different kings and mother to 2 different kings, Harthacnut by Canute and Edward the Confessor by Ethelred. Her children, cousins to each other, became rivals, claimants, and eventually pawns in the great dynastic reset that would come in 1066. Ethelred's reign is often remembered as a slow collapse, but it was also the beginning of the end for the pure Anglo-Saxon monarchy. His cousin marriage to Emma linked him to Normandy, his indecision opened the door to Danish conquest, and his children would preside over the monarchy's final pre-Norman chapters. The irony? Ethelred's attempt to secure stability through a cousin marriage across the Channel did exactly the opposite. It handed England's fate to a new family of cousins, one that would return with ships, swords, and a sense of entitlement rooted in shared ancestry. And at the head of that family, of course, was William the Conqueror, a man whose own claim to the English throne rested not on innovation or strength of arms alone, but on the oldest royal logic of all. I'm family too.